President Joe Biden has warned Russia that there would be clear and severe consequences if Russia were to use chemical weapons in Ukraine. But what if that thin red line was crossed? What if the US and Russia were to go to war over Ukraine? 2 hours before war. Somewhere in western Ukraine, a Ukrainian base hosting several dozen American trainers comes under attack from Russian missiles. This is where America had been training Ukraine's conventional and special forces for the last 8 years, and where US trainers now work hand in hand with their Ukrainian counterparts to get 100,000 Ukrainian reservists ready to fight in the east. The attack is symbolic more than anything, Russia flexing its muscles and warning the US to back off from the war in Ukraine. However, a lucky missile strike happens to hit the American barracks. 15 American soldiers die from the Russian attack, 1 hour and 45 minutes before the war. The casualties are quickly confirmed and relayed back to Washington, D.C. via the U.S. military's advanced extremely high-frequency satellite network. The constellation of 6 satellites sits in geostationary orbit and relay data via jam-resistant communication links for the US, Canadian, Australian, Netherlands, and British militaries. News of the casualties are on the president's desk just 2 minutes after the attack occurs. President Biden immediately calls for an emergency session of Congress, 15 minutes before war. The deaths of U.S. service members is unacceptable to the American people. Russia has been warned that any attack against American supply convoys or personnel would be an attack on America itself. With a few dissenting votes, the American Congress approves a formal declaration of war against Russia, with the stated intent of neutralizing Russian forces inside Ukraine and preventing them from re-entering the country. 5 minutes before war. Addressing the world and the nation via the White House Oval Office, President Joe Biden announces a declaration of war by the United States of America against the Russian Federation. He makes it clear that the military objectives of this war are to neutralize Russian forces in Ukraine and liberate the eastern occupied regions. U.S. ground forces will not be entering into Russia itself. This is an attempt to limit the escalation of hostilities and prevent an immediate escalation to nuclear conflict. As the president is delivering his remarks, the United States military is already on the move. War, Hour 1. From the decks of U.S. ships across the world's oceans, SM-3 missiles modified to carry out anti-satellite attacks fire into the sky. Their targets are Russian military and civilian satellites that help provide communications and GPS navigation to Russian military units. American F-15s aid in the attack, launching their own anti-satellite missiles from high altitude. The attacks are limited and focused. Destroying a satellite in orbit causes a massive debris cloud that can damage or even destroy friendly satellites. Russia, which also has been preparing for the possibility of war with the US ever since the start of the invasion in Ukraine, responds with its own attacks against American satellites. However, Russian weapons are greatly limited in number. Only 2 of the American advanced extremely high-frequency satellites are neutralized in this way. By comparison, Russian GPS is rendered completely ineffective due to kinetic strikes and electronic attacks against the Russian space network. American ships and cruise missile-laden submarines in both the Pacific Ocean and Baltic Sea launched several additional salvos, this time targeting Russian ground and naval infrastructure. Within minutes of President Biden's declaration of war, hundreds of American missiles are streaking toward targets in St. Petersburg, Kaliningrad, and the Pacific naval bases of Kamchatsky, Magadan, Petropavlovsk, and Sovetskaya Gavan. An American submarine, having secretly transited into the Black Sea weeks ago, launches its own attacks against Russian naval facilities in Sevastopol and occupied Crimea. Russian air defense units detect the incoming barrage of missiles and begin to go to work. S-400 and older S-300 units track the incoming missiles. American cruise missiles are subsonic and easy prey for advanced air defenses, and Russia boasts some of the best in the world. However, this first salvo is immense, and while dozens of American cruise missiles are destroyed, some manage to slip through the blistering barrage of air defenses to hit their targets. Air defense radars are primary targets for the U.S. Navy, but Russia has defended these well, knowing that the U.S. retains the advantage in the air. Only a few U.S. missiles find their mark, punching holes in the Russian air defense network of Kaliningrad, where most of the strikes have been focused. In the Pacific theater, more U.S. missiles find their targets, given the thinner air defenses there. With the war in Ukraine going poorly for Russia, critical air defense units have been stripped from Russia's less important Pacific theater to bolster its defenses in the east. Most of the Russian ports in the Pacific are rendered unusable. The Russian Navy has a fraction of the capabilities of the U.S. Navy, and its ships are being kept close to home, where they can enjoy the cover of air and ground-based defenses. However, some Russian submarines are on the prowl in the Atlantic and Pacific, and the hunt for these Russian infiltrators is on. By the end of the first hour of the war, U.S. troops in European bases are being recalled from leave for mobilization. NATO holds a hasty assembly, but most of the member nations do not wish to invoke Article 5. This was, after all, prompted by a strike on a Ukrainian facility that happened to hold American trainers. Only Poland agrees to join the American war effort, mostly out of necessity. Poland borders Kaliningrad and Belarus both, and will be pushed into the crosshairs of the Russian military anyway, as it's the only place the US can stage a push into Ukraine. Hour 3. A barrage of Russian missiles is detected incoming at high speed by long-range airborne and ground-based air defense radars in Poland. The targets are Polish air bases where U.S. Air Force troops and aircraft are stationed. Missiles inbound from Kaliningrad are more difficult to defend against, given the faster flight time have managed to evade U.S. and Polish air defenses in the region. The U.S. has positioned Patriot batteries in Poland since the start of the war in Ukraine, but these have been tasked with protecting the Polish Aegis Ashore facility that even now is nearing completion after years of delays and construction challenges. Poland is one of NATO's most important states given its proximity to Russia and the Russian enclave in Kaliningrad. This means that the powerful Aegis Ashore facility will one day be the cornerstone of one of the most robust missile and air defense networks in the world. But that day is not today, and the facility is still not operational. Russia pummels the construction site with long-range missiles, but missile defenses manage to stem the bulk of the tide. A few slip through, causing some moderate damage that will ensure the facility will not be completed before the end of the war. Polish air bases also take a pummeling, but the ferocity of the strike is not as great as it was feared to be. That's because Russia has exhausted many of its precision weapons in the fight against Ukraine, and crippling sanctions have made resupply impossible. Russia produces almost none of the sophisticated electronics its advanced missiles need, and what started as a massive stockpile of thousands of missiles has been severely reduced. Any that remain will be needed to counter U.S. forces inside Ukraine itself. Hour 8. Aircraft from across U.S. air bases both at home and abroad take to the sky. They're moving to European airfields from where they'll be able to support the offensive against Russian forces on the ground. America's vast fleet of 650 tanker aircraft, the largest in the world, flies orbits around the Atlantic Ocean, allowing shorter-range F-15s and F-16s to make the transit to Europe from the homeland. Hour 36. U.S. mobilization is ramping up, and troops are preparing to move equipment and personnel into transport ships for the journey across the Atlantic. The largest airlift campaign in the world is already in full swing, with American cargo planes ferrying troops and heavy vehicles to Europe. However, even America's impressive logistics fleet is simply not enough to move large enough quantities of equipment for an offensive. For now, Ukraine is on its own, and Russia is pouring all available manpower into the conflict before the U.S. arrives. Hour 40. Russia does not wish to antagonize other NATO members, thus expected incursions into the Baltics never materialize. Neither do long-range strikes against America's most important bases in Germany. Instead, Russia scrambles to put together a massive offensive in the east of Ukraine. Its strategy is simple. If it can overwhelm Ukrainian defenses, then it can deny the U.S. the very country it's trying to push Russia out of. But the Ukrainian defenders are resilient as ever, even as Russia mobilizes its reserve battalion tactical groups for battle. This will put tens of thousands of additional troops in the east of Ukraine in the next few days, overwhelming the defenders. Meanwhile, inside Russia, an emergency draft is instituted. Hour 42. Hastily prepped for their missions, American B-2 bombers have been flying from home bases in the continental U.S. for the last 17 hours. Now, the stealthy planes have penetrated deep inside Russian air defense zones and unleashed their cargo on Russian radar and communication hubs inside of Kaliningrad. The goal is to shut down the military enclave's ability to defend itself from air attack, and thus pin massive contingents of Russian forces down, preventing them from launching an offensive into Poland. 2 B-2s are lost in the attack, but the damage to Russian communications and air defense infrastructure is significant and greatly expands gaps in air defense coverage. The U.S. Navy takes advantage of these gaps by launching additional missile strikes, supplemented by strike aircraft from carriers in the Mediterranean and ready forces stationed across Europe. The U.S. Suppression of Enemy Air Defenses, or SEAD mission, is slowly but steadily stripping away Russian air defenses inside the military enclave. Russian fighters alone are no match for American planes with superior sensors, electronics, and weapons, but working in conjunction with very robust air defenses, they become a serious threat. Dozens of aircraft are destroyed on both sides of the conflict, as Russia tries to keep its air defenses online and deny the U.S. and Polish the skies. Hour 60. A Russian attack submarine scores a devastating blow on an American destroyer operating inside the Baltic Sea. This is one of Russia's most modern subs, and while not as capable as American counterparts, still a significant threat to the U.S. Navy in turbulent waters of the Baltic Sea. The submarine is pursued relentlessly by surface vessels working in conjunction with the airborne ASW aircraft, but manages to slink away, using a heavy storm as cover. Hundreds of American sailors die in the attack, and a multi-billion-dollar ship sinks beneath the waves. The Russian surface navy has yet to show itself in battle, sticking close to shore where it's too dangerous for U.S. forces to target them. Day 4. A flood of cyber attacks rocks both Russia and the U.S., with both sides unleashing the full force of their cyber warfare capabilities against the other. The damage to civilian infrastructure on both sides is intense, but the U.S. proves more robust, and within 48 hours American markets are operating as normal again. Day 6. The war over Kaliningrad has reduced Russia's local air defenses to small bubbles of protection, but at the cost of many American aircraft. The enclave, however, is now being mercilessly pummeled from the air as American B-52s launch punishing sorties from their home bases in the United States. Supply and logistic hubs are being set up inside Europe to allow the big planes to be closer to the action, and thus fly more sorties. But for now, the planes must make the day-and-a-half round trip to strike their targets and return home, slowing down the pace of the offensive. However, the vast amount of firepower each plane brings to the fight is devastating for Russian forces. With ground-based air defenses severely attrited by the air and missile strikes, American and Polish fighters can now fly air superiority missions over Kaliningrad, daring Russian MiGs to rise up and meet them. As shown in Ukraine, the Russian Air Force is not nearly as capable as once believed, though it is still very numerous. The US has many times more planes, but for now they're not in Europe, bringing a numbers parity to both sides. US and Polish forces, however, have the advantage with superior sensors, while Russia has the advantage in maneuverability and thrust-to-weight ratio, making their planes deadly in dogfights. Unfortunately for Russia, the age of the dogfight is gone, and most engagements are carried out from beyond visual range. Scores of aircraft are downed in the fiercest air battle since World War II, with the losses heavily on the Russian side. By the end of the first week of fighting, Kaliningrad is under serious threat from the air, but the United States has expended vast amounts of munitions in the attacks and must pause air operations to give time for rearming and refitting. For a few days, all is eerily quiet over the skies that were recently roaring with the sound of dueling jet fighters. Week 2. At the start of the second week of fighting, U.S. forces have begun to amass in Europe in significant numbers. It'll still take time for them to prepare for battle, and even America's vast logistics fleet will take months to ferry the U.S.'s firepower to Europe. However, smaller and more mobile forces have already begun the trip to Ukraine, and a large number of attack helicopters are being amassed to repel the Russian ground assault in the Donbas region. They're simply waiting for the refitting of the U.S. Air Force so it can provide the needed air cover. New Russian battalion tactical groups have entered Ukraine after being hastily prepared for combat. However, the hasty preparations have wreaked havoc on Russian supply chains, which have already been struggling even before the broadening of the war. Now Russian vehicles and personnel find themselves stalled out in massive convoys reminiscent of Russia's failed push to Kyiv. U.S. aircraft take the opportunity presented to them, but only the F-35 can penetrate dangerous skies still not secured by proper seat operations. Forced to carry weapons internally, the F-35s are very limited in firepower, and the attacks do little real damage to the massive formations of enemy troops. However, they are a massive morale boost to the beleaguered Ukrainian defenders who have been dreaming of the day U.S. air power would come to their aid. As the second week of fighting comes to a close, the Russian offensive in the east once more bogs down. This time, though, because of Russia's crippling lack of logistics, Ukrainian defenders take the opportunity to pull back and create some breathing room, resupplying and redeploying to new defensive positions. Russia attempts to use air power to pummel the Ukrainian front lines, but very quickly discovers this to be a mistake. Lurking over the skies of Ukraine are a number of American F-22 Raptors. Deploying under the Rapid Raptor program, the premier air supremacy fighter in the world was some of the first American aircraft to arrive on scenes. While Russia can threaten Ukrainian airspace with air defenses based on its own soil, the Raptors are too far away from these defenses for detection. Russian aircraft experience significant losses before the air offensive is abruptly terminated. Week 4. The 1st American Armored Brigade combat team has crossed the border into Ukraine. A second quickly follows. An expected offensive by the U.S. and Poland into Kaliningrad never materializes, as the U.S. doesn't wish to provoke Russia into using nuclear weapons by physically invading its territory. Instead, Russian troops inside the military enclave are suppressed by ongoing air campaigns against them. America has achieved not air supremacy but air dominance in the region. For the first time in history, Russian and American armor clash in combat. Both sides have prepared for this conflict for decades, but after the end of the Cold War, corruption and a weak economy has hollowed out Russia's once formidable capabilities. The first assault comes in the dead of night. U.S. forces down to the individual soldier are all equipped with night vision. Russian forces, on the other hand, only have night vision and thermals on their heavy vehicles, with a smattering of night vision devices across their infantry. America owns the night, and the ferocity of the offensive rocks the Russian forces to their core. Russian battalion tactical groups are massive beasts with a very heavy top-down command structure. U.S. forces, however, enjoy a great degree of autonomy and are encouraged to seize the initiative. While the Russian BTG is superior in numbers, the U.S. attacks using smaller, much more maneuverable forces. The confusion of fighting in the dark with few night vision capabilities only makes the situation worse for the Russian defenders. Russian T-90s, T-80s, and T-72s have struggled against Ukrainian tanks. Against modern M1A2C Abrams equipped with the latest upgrade packages fighting in the dead of night, they're decimated. Guided to their targets by superior sensors and fire control computers, Abrams' silver bullets bore through thick Russian armor, the edges burning away, creating a self-sharpening penetrator that leads to an extremely emotional event for the Russian crew. Russian tanks fire back with cannon-fired anti-tank missiles, but America has sent the very tip of its spear into this first fight. While not every American Abrams has been equipped with the trophy countermeasure system, the tanks leading the charge into Russian lines have been, and the Israeli-developed countermeasures prove an able defense against the few Russian tanks to survive initial contact. The problem for Russian armor is that American tanks are engaging them from greater distances than they're capable of, thanks to the superior fire computers and sights the Abrams are equipped with. While in Ukraine, Russia has failed to use its infantry to screen its armored forces against anti-tank kill teams, the U.S. makes no such mistake, and the offensive is partnered with mechanized infantry forces who quickly engage and neutralize pockets of resistance left behind in the wake of the overwhelming armored assault. Once more, U.S. forces' abilities to see in the dark gives them an insurmountable advantage over the far less technologically sophisticated opponents. Close air support aircraft work in conjunction with the ground assault to pummel Russian positions. Vaunted A-10 Warthogs unleash hell from their massive GAU-8 Avenger 30mm cannons, while F-15s and F-35s provide air cover against a potential incursion by Russian MiGs. Standoff attack munitions have devastated many of Russia's long-range air defenses located in theater, and seed operations have greatly attrited many of the air defenses just over the Russian border that could threaten Allied aircraft inside Ukraine. The campaign has come at a steep cost for the U.S. Air Force and Navy, but the benefits are worth the price, as American close air support aircraft mercilessly pummel Russian positions. Short-range air defenses are much more difficult to target and destroy, and a number of American Apaches fall prey to these and man-portable shoulder-fired air defense weapons. The tough A-10s prove far more difficult to bring down, however, constructed to survive exactly this type of large-scale combat during the Cold War. Overall, though, Russian air defenses managed to score only minor losses on the U.S. air fleet before they themselves are destroyed. While Russia has completely failed to conduct combined arms operations, the U.S. teaches Russia's underfunded and poorly trained forces a masterclass in modern combined arms warfare. Week 5. Additional American Armored Brigade combat teams make the transition to Ukraine. U.S. forces relieve Ukrainian forces along the front of Russia, giving the exhausted defenders a chance to rest and recuperate. The main thrust of the American advance is toward Kherson, with the U.S. forces currently engaged in urban fighting against Russian forces for the liberation of the city. American infantry is well versed in urban combat thanks to 2 decades of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the terrain favors the defenders. U.S. casualties are significant, but with air superiority and superior training, U.S. forces are pushing the Russians out of Kherson. The local civilian populations that remain in the besieged city welcomes the Americans as liberators and aids them in the struggle against Russian forces, only complicating matters for the Russians. Outside of Kherson, the U.S. Special Operations Forces conduct daily nighttime raids against Russian logistics networks, crippling resupply operations into Kherson. The advantage U.S. troops enjoy during nighttime gives them the significant edge over the Russians, as does the fact that the local civilians throw their full support behind the Americans. Along the Polish-Kaliningrad border, skirmishes are common, but there's no full-scale fighting. Polish forces have created a massive defense front in order to keep Russians from encroaching into Poland. But by now, U.S. and Polish air forces have completely destroyed Russia's air defense networks in the military enclave. Any Russian forces that would threaten Poland come under immediate attack. Losses have been steep for both nations' air forces, but Russia's losses have been steeper. Not only are Polish and American aircraft far more modern, but Russia's legacy of internal corruption and poor maintenance haunts it as it tries to fend off constant air attacks. Sortie rates for Russian aircraft plummet almost immediately and never recover enough to create a viable defense. To make matters worse, the shortage of critical electronic components has also crippled Russian air defenses. Already during hostilities with Ukraine, the Russian military was running out of air defense missiles, but now all of its stockpiles for use in case of war with NATO have been nearly exhausted, and there's no domestic replenishment available. Within another week or two, the Russians will be reduced to Cold War-era anti-aircraft cannons, which are completely ineffective against high-altitude targets, though still pose a threat to low-flying aircraft. At the end of the first month of fighting, the Russian military is in dire straits. It's already exhausted by 2 months of fighting in Ukraine. The majority of U.S. ground combat power is not yet in theater, but well on its way, and what elements are already operating inside of Ukraine are putting incredible pressure on demoralized and exhausted Russian troops. U.S. losses are light, Russian casualties are steep, and many of its gains in Ukraine are being reversed. The U.S. has yet to initiate a large campaign against Russian forces, waiting until the bulk of its fighting units are inside the country before launching a massive blitz across the 800-mile front in the east of the nation. For now, the Americans are reinforcing Ukraine's exhausted defenders and relieving them for much-needed reconstitution and resupply. Only in Kherson have the Americans launched a true offensive with the goal of opening a corridor to Crimea. Week 6. Ukrainian forces and their American allies end the Russian occupation of Kherson. The city is the only place U.S. forces have sustained significant casualties. All along the wide-open plains of eastern Ukraine, American forces have remained in defensive postures, repelling initial attempts by the Russians to push them back. Now the front settles into a strategic stalemate as the U.S. waits for the arrival of the bulk of its firepower. In the air, however, the war continues. U.S. forces work day and night to attrit Russian air defenses. The use of drones, standoff attack munitions, and F-35s help curb what would otherwise be very high casualties, as does the fact that Russia is rapidly running out of air defense missiles. Turkey allows the passage of U.S. Navy ships into the Black Sea, leading to a brief but intense confrontation between the Russian and American navies. The Russians managed to sink 2 American destroyers in exchange for nearly their entire Black Sea fleet, which is forced to remain in port or operate under the threat of being sunk. Those ships are soon destroyed at their moorings by the American stealth aircraft. U.S. Marines arrive in Odessa to bring preparations for an amphibious assault into Crimea. Week 9. In one of the fastest mobilization efforts in history, the United States has surged vast amounts of combat firepower to Ukraine over the course of 2 months. The battle for Ukraine is ready to begin in earnest. Week 10. Russian forces have had their supply lines continuously disrupted by U.S. air and special forces operations. Ammunition is low across the front, as is food, medicine, and morale. Russia has entered this war with an insufficiently large enough logistics fleet, and now after the destruction of hundreds of its trucks, its logistic networks are close to complete collapse. Russian forces have been forced to pull back dozens of miles across the front, but not due to military action, because supply lines are needed to be shortened in order to keep units resupplied with a diminished transport fleet. 20,000 additional Russian forces have surged into the nation, the vast majority of them conscripts. These soldiers are poorly equipped and suffer from extremely low morale. The front has been quiet for 2 weeks, but all of that is about to change. In a blistering nighttime attack, U.S. forces surge forward across the wide front in eastern Ukraine. The use of nighttime operations throws the Russians into disarray as they still lack night fighting capabilities in any significant number. Only in the cities is the offensive slowed, as the fighting becomes a block-by-block slog that favors the Russian occupiers. A thrust into Crimea splits Russian forces into 2, as simultaneously U.S. and Ukrainian Marines launch an amphibious assault outside of Sevastopol. The operation is a costly one. Russian resistance is stiffer here after 8 years of occupying Crimea. However, the rapid advance of American armor into Crimea cuts off Sevastopol from the rest of Russia. Rather than attempting to take the city by force, U.S. and Ukrainian forces surround it and seal it off from resupply, allowing civilians to flee through humanitarian corridors while keeping Russian forces pinned down. Cut off from outside supply, they will eventually either starve to death or be forced to surrender. With U.S. forces inside of Mariupol by the end of the week and 100,000 Ukrainian troops trained and equipped in the last 2 months, Russia faces a choice: admit defeat in Ukraine and retreat to its own borders, continue in a senseless defense of occupied territories that is doomed to failure at great cost to its own troops, or widen the conflict through the use of nuclear weapons. In what's become a modern desert storm, U.S. forces and their Polish allies working in conjunction with Ukraine's defenders have rolled back most of Russia's gains in a matter of weeks. The deciding factors are superior morale, training, equipment, and the fact that Russia has been unable to properly resupply its forces for weeks. But victory hasn't come without a cost to the U.S. and Poland. Thousands are dead and wounded, and the loss in aircraft is significant. Stockpiles of air defenses and ground attack missiles have also been greatly depleted. Replenishment will take years and leave the U.S. military vulnerable to any sudden aggression by China in the Pacific. One of America's greatest modern weaknesses is the lack of a robust industrial mobilization capability, leaving it to resupply losses in missiles and equipment through a slow, steady trickle that will take the better part of a decade. The date is March 4, 2022, and after years of deliberation, both Georgia and Bosnia and Herzegovina have officially been accepted as full NATO partners. Ukraine now reinvigorates its push for NATO membership, while Russia has for the last 6 months warned of military action. Alarmed by what it views as encroachment of NATO on its borders, Russia at last responds to the ascension of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Georgia by massing forces on its western border. Russia is gambling that the other NATO nations will reconsider admitting the 2 new members, or at least not be willing to go to war over the defense of brand new members to the alliance. Russia, however, has completely underestimated the solidarity of the alliance, realizing that NATO is in essence a worthless entity unless Article 5 of the treaty is immediately enforced. NATO warns Russia that an attack on one ally is considered an attack on all allies. To reinforce the point, NATO troops are sent into Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the alliance's most vulnerable members given their direct proximity to Russia. Russia, however, sees this as an unacceptable show of force, and the move proves to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Without warning, Russian armor pours into Latvia and Lithuania, linking up with forces in Kaliningrad. World War III has officially begun. For the first month of fighting, Russian forces push as far west as Poland, but the offensive grinds to a halt as NATO members finish mobilizing and their resistance solidifies. With American troops and equipment making landfall in France and Germany, NATO is now launching vicious counterattacks against Russia's forces in Poland. In the Pacific, the American Navy steams towards Russia's eastern coast, bringing with it a Marine Expeditionary Force meant to open a second front in the war and split Russia's forces. Russia is faced with a losing proposition and decides to gamble. It authorizes a single nuclear strike against Berlin, betting that while European NATO members may retaliate with their limited nuclear arsenals, the Americans won't risk the destruction of their cities to support their European allies. The date is now April 12th, 0205 hours Zulu. American and Chinese infrared recon satellites both pick up the telltale fiery plume of an ICBM launch from a missile farm in the south of Russia. 2 minutes later, the American president is awoken from his sleep and given the news. Russia has launched a single nuclear device, unknown payload, likely target in Western Europe. The U.S. Air Force's Global Strike Command has for weeks been flying nuclear alert missions with its fleet of B-52 bombers, maintaining a nuclear-armed force in the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as its predecessor, the Strategic Air Command, once did for decades during the Cold War. With the detected launch of a Russian nuclear weapon, a priority flash is immediately dispatched to the airborne forces and alert forces on the ground. Flight crews stationed overseas in Japan, on the west coast of the United States, and in Europe all review their single integrated operational plan, which lays out the exact flight route, refueling track, and targets for each of the bomber crews. Most aircraft have 2 primary targets, with 2 alternate targets to be struck should they be unable to make it to their primary targets. Within minutes, the crews are in the air, and those already on alert patrols immediately set their course for the positive control turnaround point, a pre-planned point near Russia where the air crews will automatically turn around unless they receive an order to strike. At missile sites across the American Midwest, the giant concrete shutters that protect the buried missiles inside their launch facilities are automatically rolled back, and the security forces personnel tasked with defending those sites go on full alert. Their orders are to defend the silos until every missile has been launched, after which they are to escort surviving missile crews out and back to a rendezvous point well away from the missile farm, for these sites will be a priority target for incoming Russian missiles. Inside underground bunkers, missile operators rehearse launch procedures, each man responsible for a group of missiles. The entire system only requires 2 out of 4 of the operators to authenticate a launch order, just in case 2 of the men get cold feet about launching a nuclear Armageddon and refuse their orders. Deep in the Arctic, Pacific, and Atlantic Ocean, the U.S.'s extremely low-frequency communication system flashes a nuclear alert to America's ballistic missile submarine fleet. Each sub carries 24 Trident missiles, and each missile carries up to 8 independently targetable warheads with a yield of 475 kilotons. America's fleet of hunter-killer attack submarines have for weeks been stalking and eliminating Russia's aging ballistic missile submarines, and the survivors are bottled up near the Russian shore where they can be protected with shore-based firepower and anti-submarine patrols. Now, America's attack submarines set course for Russia's coast, and their mission is to eliminate Russia's surviving nuke boats, though it will cost America's submarine fleet dearly, as Russia's Air Force and Surface Navy fiercely defend their surviving ballistic missile subs. At 0209 hours, the American president is told that the American recon assets have positive confirmation of a nuclear detonation in Berlin. The Russians have fired an older single-warhead ICBM, yet with a yield large enough to completely destroy the city of 3.6 million. On a hotline direct with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the president is told that Britain is already issuing a fire order to retaliate for the attack. The president knows that the attack on Berlin was a gamble by the Russians, who don't believe that the US will risk an escalation and attacks on its own cities to defend Europe. An emergency flash is dispatched by the US's ELF communication system to a lurking Ohio-class submarine currently on station deep beneath the ice of the North Pole. After authenticating the order, the sub breaches through the 5-foot-thick ice and the door on a single dorsally mounted launch tube props open. The navigation system on the Trident II missile located inside the launch tube is activated, and a mission trajectory is automatically loaded into the flight computer. Then, a steam generator ignites a solid-grain rocket motor, which feeds superheated exhaust into a tank of chilled water. The water evaporates and expands, forcing the missile within the launch tube to be launched upwards and out. After which, the first stage motor ignites and the missile screams upward and towards space. An astro-inertial guidance system on board the missile uses star positioning to fine-tune the accuracy of its trajectory, as GPS has long been unreliable due to Russian attacks on NATO satellites. The Russians have bet wrong, and minutes later, 8 475-kiloton warheads detonate over the Russian missile facility which launched the Berlin attack. Simultaneously, a British attack strikes the cities of Ekaterinburg and Novosibirsk, with a population of 1.5 million or 3 million together. NATO has responded in kind to the Berlin attack, and America has both punished Russia's nuclear forces for the attack and shown that it will stand with its allies. In the halls of the Kremlin, a desperate power struggle plays out. 3 million Russians lie dead, and the US has obliterated one of Russia's major nuclear missile facilities, destroying dozens of ICBMs in place. Russian ballistic submarines, considered to be the most survivable element of the nuclear triad, have also been decimated by American attack submarines, though the US has lost 12 subs of its own in its quest to eliminate the remaining Russian boats. Military leadership clashes with the civilian leadership and demands a retaliatory attack on American missile facilities. With US reinforcements in force on the Western Front and Russians starting to lose ground in Poland, battlefield commanders have for the last week been requesting a release on strategic nuclear weapons to use against American infantry and tanks. The fierce debate on the use of tactical weapons is reignited, and when further nuclear attacks are denied, Russian military leadership stages a stunning coup. The Russian president is removed from power, and Russian commanders receive authorization for the use of a dozen tactical weapons against NATO forces in Europe. Within a half hour, NATO troop concentrations in Poland are hammered by low-yield nuclear attacks, killing tens of thousands. American reinforcements fresh from the States and currently massing around the Ramstein military facilities in Germany are hit with 3 tactical devices. The Marine Expeditionary Force in the Pacific, staging out of Japan, is also struck by a single device, as are the 2 naval carrier battle groups supporting the invasion. By 9 a.m., American military forces have suffered more casualties than all wars since World War II combined, and the ability for NATO to push back Russian forces in Poland is eliminated. While Russia has maintained an inventory of low-yield tactical nuclear weapons to counter America's overwhelming conventional firepower advantage, the United States has not kept an active inventory of tactical devices for decades. This leaves the American president with few options for a comparable retaliatory attack. While the yields on America's airborne submarine and ground-launched nuclear devices can be dialed down, there's no way to broadcast that fact to the Russians, and little chance they'd believe it. An attack with traditional ICBMs, submarine-launched missiles, or airborne nuclear cruise missiles will seem to Russia like a full-blown attack and risk escalating the war into a total nuclear confrontation. Yet the president has little choice. Tens of thousands of American service members are dead. U.S. forces in Europe have been badly damaged by the attacks, and both carrier battle groups supporting the Pacific invasion are reporting major losses of ships, aircraft, and personnel. The Marine Invasion Force in Okinawa is combat ineffective, 4 divisions reporting over 55% casualties each. Resigning himself to a list of terrible options, the president orders a retaliatory attack using ground-based ICBMs. The Air Force's Global Strike Command nuclear bomber fleet is to approach and hold at their failsafe points, ready to proceed to their targets should Russia retaliate again. At Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, a launch order is authorized by the two-man Minuteman launch crew, and a single Minuteman III missile roars into the night sky. 60 seconds later, the second stage of the missile ignites, separating from the spent first booster stage. Adjustments using the second stage thrust vector control keeps the missile on its course, and another 60 seconds later, the flight computer separates the second stage and fires the engine on the third and final stage. By now, the missile has reached space, and as the third stage engine burns out, reverse thrust separates the three warheads and their penetration aids from the launch vehicle. Some of the penetration aids explode, showering space with millions of pieces of reflective aluminum, which wreak havoc on radar used by missile interceptors, while other aids simulate the real warheads and serve as dummy targets for any Russian interceptors. With no real Russian anti-ballistic missile defense programs, though, the warheads and the dummies all re-enter the Earth's atmosphere completely unharmed. 23 minutes after launch, three separate 475-kiloton nuclear explosions rock Eastern Europe. Russian forces in Poland are obliterated by two nuclear strikes many times greater in magnitude than those used against NATO forces, while yet another Russian nuclear missile facility is struck by the third warhead. With American weapons targeting their missile fields and systematically eliminating Russia's ability to respond to nuclear attacks, the final order is given for a full-blown nuclear response. American reconnaissance satellites and electronic eavesdropping assets all pick up the telltale signs of preparatory operations for a nuclear launch across Russia's remaining missile farms. The order to attack is mirrored in the U.S., and launch officers in North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana receive the order to launch. Simultaneously, American airborne assets receive an emergency flash, which, when authenticated, authorizes the air crews to proceed to their targets with full nuclear release. American ballistic missile submarines breach through the thick polar ice or rise to 25 feet below the waves of the Pacific in the North Sea. As Russian missiles clear their silos, it's America's nuclear ballistic missile subs which launch the first wave of retaliatory attacks, almost as fast as Russian ground forces. American submarine-launched missiles target Russia's remaining missile fields in a desperate hope to destroy them before they can finish launch operations. But for the most part, the American strikes fail to stop the launches. Secondary military targets are then struck, with major Russian military bases, supply depots, troop staging areas, and airfields all being obliterated in nuclear fire within 10 minutes of the start of the Russian attack. As Russia's ICBMs climb into the atmosphere, a wave of American ballistic missile defense systems immediately spring into action. Having spent billions on ballistic missile defense since the 1980s, all in a bid to make Reagan's Star Wars concept a reality, America now attacks the incoming missiles with a variety of tools. Airborne laser systems in Europe and flying in the Pacific managed to strike at a handful of ICBMs during their vulnerable ascent stage, superheating the missile body from hundreds of miles away with a powerful aircraft-mounted laser system. As the missiles climb into space, ballistic missile defense sites across the west coast of the United States launch their ground-based interceptors. Using a powerful radar, the interceptors scream toward the incoming missiles in a bid to destroy them through kinetic impact before they can re-enter the atmosphere. The Russian missiles, however, immediately disperse their own penetration aids, and a shower of billions of pieces of aluminum chaff wreaks hell on American interceptor radar. The interceptors switch to their visual interception systems, and advanced computer programs frantically scramble to identify the incoming warheads visually, ignoring the clouds of chaff. Half of the interceptors miss their targets. The other half manage to strike, yet of the successful intercepts, a full third are of dummy warheads. To make matters worse, the US only has an inventory of about 60 interceptors ready to fire and are completely overwhelmed by an incoming horde of hundreds of independently targeted warheads. 24 minutes after launch, the West Coast is the first hit. 1 megaton strikes against Los Angeles, Seattle, Portland, and others obliterate the most populated cities on the American West Coast. A follow-on 450 kiloton strike destroys the Los Angeles harbor area, along with tens of thousands of homes and the naval base at San Diego. Edwards Air Force Base in the California desert is struck by 2 450 kiloton strikes, as is Vandenberg Air Force Base. 3 minutes later, nuclear impacts strike the American Midwest. North American Aerospace Defense Command at Peterson Air Force Base is incinerated by a megaton blast, and the Cheyenne Mountain Complex is struck by 2 ground penetration munitions, though the blasts managed to do little damage to the deeply buried facility. Strikes continue to roll eastwards, and a saturation of 300 kiloton strikes decimates the American Farm Belt. These munitions are programmed to be ground bursts, resulting in the scattering of millions of tons of highly radioactive dirt across America's most fertile farmland. Another 3 minutes later and the East Coast is struck by the Russian ICBMs. Washington is obliterated by 2 separate megaton blasts, as is New York City, the financial heart of America. The American president, however, is safe from the nuclear blasts. He has long ago boarded what is nicknamed the Doomsday plane, an airborne command post from which he can still manage America's remaining military and civilian forces. With satellite and ground communications completely eradicated, a fleet of Air Force planes now makes up a global command and control system, linking up surviving military forces with the president. Soon, his plane will land at an intact airfield and he'll be helicoptered out to a surviving supercarrier, from which he will continue to command the survivors of America's military and oversee the reconstruction, if any possible, of what remains of America, all from the safety of the Atlantic Ocean. Russia's on the warpath, and if successful in Ukraine, is unlikely to stop there. Lithuania, with EU support, has shut off the flow of military and economic material to the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, triggering a threat of invasion by Russia in retaliation. A world away, China flexes its muscles as it threatens the United States and their continued support for Taiwan. Fears of World War III are growing by the day, and the United States is taking them very, very seriously. Before we discuss how the US is preparing for the Third World War, first we need to know what its potential enemies are doing. China has long been preparing for a confrontation with the US as it seeks to become the world's dominant superpower. Currently, China falls short of the qualifications for a global superpower, qualifications which only the US fills at the moment. But with its dizzying economic and military growth, it might be less than a decade before the Chinese Communist Party can project power all over the world. China's preparations for a showdown with the West include dislodging the United States as the most important economic power in the world. It also has safeguards to its own economic interests in the wake of economic warfare versus the US, and to achieve this aim in 2013, it launched the Belt and Road Initiative. This massively ambitious plan included building new land and sea trade routes all over the world to connect China economically with nations all the way from Europe to Africa. To achieve this, the nation has not just invested in its own infrastructure, but in building trade infrastructure in other nations as well. However, China's partnership with host nations is more often than not extremely predatory. They offer economic loans to build massive projects that promise economic prosperity, like seaports and rail yards. However, the terms of those loans often dictate that Chinese companies must be hired to do the construction, leaving few jobs for locals. Interest rates on the debt traps is often so high that a poor third world nation is guaranteed to default. Included in the penalties for defaulting are clauses such as China owning exclusive rights to the infrastructure it builds for terms as long as a century. It is in effect a modern version of soft colonialism. China's plan is to have heavy influence in the trade of goods throughout Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, putting it in a very strong position to dictate geopolitics in its ever-growing sphere of influence. China's next preparation for war with the US includes securing its vulnerable trade routes through the South China Sea and the very valuable oil and natural gas deposits in the region, as well as the remaining rich fishing grounds. This effort began with the construction of artificial islands in 2013, which continued unopposed despite an international ruling by the World Court in The Hague that such island building and claims to economic exclusion zones around them were illegal. Foreign pressure also failed to stop China from stealing claims to oil supplies by neighbors such as Vietnam, or of using its coast guard to bully and intimidate the merchant and fishing fleets of other nations out of their own territorial waters. These islands have now become heavily fortified military installations, which include modern missile defenses, runways long enough for long-range attack aircraft, and an ever-growing network of surveillance assets, all geared for one purpose: detect, track, and destroy the U.S. Navy. Further preparations have included the addition of dozens of new ships to the People's Liberation Navy, which is now officially the largest in the world. Recently, China's second aircraft carrier came online, and in a few years will be ready for battle, greatly enhancing the CCP's reach in all the important sea and air domains. With Russia's increased belligerence in Europe, there's a serious concern that the two nations might partner up in an attempt to turn the current US-led world order on its head. Despite China's increasing capabilities, it still does not have the power to defeat the US in a one-on-one confrontation, and it might hope to split the US attention by partnering with Russia, thus forcing America to choose fighting between China in the Pacific or Russia in Europe. For decades, the United States maintained a policy of fielding a powerful enough military to fight and win two simultaneous wars against near-peer adversaries. However, with China's rapid ascension, this has become officially impossible without bankrupting the US, and thus America has been forced to accept that it may only be able to defeat one near-peer adversary at a time. The question is, how is the US preparing to do that, given the increasing likelihood of China and Russia starting a Third World War. First, the situation in the Pacific might seem dire with China's numerically superior navy, but the real measure of naval power is not the number of vessels, but in the number of battle force missiles. These are the number of missiles that both navies can bring to bear against each other. The US maintains around 10,000 missiles versus the PLAN's estimated 2,000. Though those numbers have changed and will continue to change as China fields larger vessels and both navies shift in composition. It's estimated that by 2030, China might have closed the gap in battle force missiles to 2/3 of US capabilities. The US's first line of defense against China is the place that's likely to be ground zero for World War III, Taiwan. The small island democracy broke away from the mainland after the nationalists were expelled by the communists in the aftermath of World War II. Since then, the former dictatorship has become a vibrant democracy that has refused to reunify and put themselves under control of the Chinese Communist Party. Securing Taiwan is not just important for the ever-intensifying global clash between authoritarianism and democracy, but also for very important political and economic reasons. Firstly, Taiwan produces around 50% of the world's semiconductors after US companies ceased production at home due to expense. Semiconductors are important for every single gadget in your life. The global economy quite literally runs on them, and they've become as valuable as a commodity as gas and oil. China itself produces between 25 and 30% of the world's semiconductor supply. So if China were to take Taiwan, it would now be in control of 3/4 of the global semiconductor supply. This would allow China to effectively shut down the economy of any nation that disagrees with it by simply barring the sale of semiconductors to it, giving China incredible power to further control global affairs and reducing the West's ability to oppose its authoritarianism. Taiwan is also politically important, as it makes up part of what's known as the First Island Chain. This is a chain of islands that extends from Japan to the Philippines and acts as a very physical barrier to the expansion of Chinese influence in the Pacific. If China were to take Taiwan, it would not just break this carefully orchestrated containment strategy, but allow China to effectively neuter Japan's ability to resist it. With aircraft and ships stationed off Taiwan, China could target Japan's lines of communication and trade routes that cross the Pacific and hem the nation in, forcing it into subservience under threat of economic starvation. If China takes Taiwan, the US commitments to defend the Philippines and Japan would be made much more difficult, if not impossible. To defend Taiwan, the US has inked several deals, selling the nation advanced weapon systems ranging from fighter aircraft to air and missile defenses. US military advisors have worked closely with the Taiwanese counterparts for years to prepare the nation for invasion. Despite threats from China, the flow of US arms to Taiwan continues unabated, and recently US President Joe Biden publicly voiced for the first time an unacknowledged truth in American politics. The United States will come to the defense of Taiwan in case of invasion. This greatly angered China, and the White House press corps was quick to walk the statement back. But what seemed like a political guffaw was likely yet another bit of intrigue meant to further the American strategy of keeping China guessing as to how the US might react to an invasion. If China cannot accurately predict what America will do should it invade Taiwan, it serves to create confusion and doubt amongst Chinese leadership. Should China prepare its economy for a flurry of global sanctions like Russia received after its invasion of Ukraine? Or should China expect American F-18s to swarm the skies over Taiwan and sink their invasion fleet? Strategic ambiguity is a powerful tool, and political theater is an excellent method for creating it. But the US is not planning on fighting a war against China alone. To this end, it has helped increase the capabilities of allies such as Japan and most notably Australia, who recently signed a military cooperation pact between itself, the United States, and the United Kingdom. The pact will not just provide security cooperation between the countries, but also help arm Australia with a fleet of nuclear attack submarines. This is of grave concern to the Chinese, who recently attempted to charm Australia away from its relationship with the US, a tactic which ultimately failed. In 10 years' time, China might not have to face off just against the US and British submarines, but Australian submarines also, putting the People's Liberation Navy as well as its all-important sea trade routes at increased risk. China imports most of its oil and gas over its seaborne trade routes, and this is exactly what the US is preparing to target in case of war, in order to strangle the Chinese economy. Recently, security meetings between Japan, India, the US, and Australia were revived after a pause during President Trump's term. The Quad, as it's informally known, aims to tackle global problems such as global warming, cybersecurity, and ensuring a free and open trade environment in the Pacific. This is a veiled implication of the Quad's discussions on how to best handle China's expansion in the South Pacific. Currently, the Quad has no military commitment to each other, but that might change in the future as President Joe Biden makes the South Pacific and confronting China an area of pressing concern for the U.S. India is the only nation in the Quad without a formal security agreement with the U.S., and it has historically refused to sign on to any security partnerships with any nation. However, that may soon change as tensions between India and China escalate, and it becomes clear that India is not able to win a war against the superior Chinese military on its own. Bringing India into the network of security alliances in the South Pacific would effectively hem China in on all sides, and more importantly put allied ships and planes directly in the path of China's trade routes through the Indian Ocean. But the United States is also taking very material steps to confronting China. War with China would be waged at sea and in the skies with very little of any action between the People's Liberation Army and the U.S. Army. This will be a war of ships and planes, not of tanks and artillery, and the U.S. is preparing accordingly. In an attempt to prepare for a confrontation with China in the skies, the U.S. has accelerated the procurement of F-35s and made getting squadrons of the fifth-generation fighter into operational status a top priority. However, both the Navy and the Air Force have expressed reservations about the F-35's current readiness, which has prompted both the services to supplement orders of F-35s with orders of upgraded legacy aircraft, such as the F-15 Eagle for the U.S. Air Force and the F-18 Super Hornet for the U.S. Navy. To counter the threat of Chinese missiles, including its very vast arsenal of ballistic missiles capable of targeting U.S. ships far out at sea, the Navy has also begun to expand the number of Aegis-equipped vessels in its fleet. Starting in 2015, the Navy also began to work on undoing the strategy of carrier-based sea dominance that it's employed since the end of the Cold War. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. Navy enjoyed unmatched superiority and complete freedom of action anywhere in the world, and thus surface fleets were retasked with simply protecting carriers. Anti-submarine warfare and anti-surface warfare skills had atrophied as naval strategy centered completely around the big carriers. Now the U.S. Navy is preparing its crews to once again face off against near-peer foes in ship-to-ship battles. Submarines are America's second greatest naval asset after aircraft carriers, and yet remain nearly completely forgotten by most of the world, which is exactly how they like it. Currently, the U.S. has a fleet of 68 submarines and is replacing the Cold War Los Angeles-class fast attack submarines with the new Virginia class. Investment in submarines has stalled recently and procurement plans are behind schedule, but the United States retains a significant advantage in undersea combat, despite China having a larger force of less advanced submarines. The realm of hypersonic missiles has received a great deal of attention ever since it was announced that the U.S. was lagging behind both Russia and China in their development. Yet there's some misinformation and confusion regarding this technology that's made Russia and China seem as if they hold a significant advantage over the US in this realm, when they really don't. Firstly, any ballistic missile is hypersonic, and China's recent test that saw a hypersonic missile fly around the world is not very impressive from a military point of view. Technically speaking, this simply doesn't add any additional capability that didn't already exist. The real threat from hypersonic missiles comes from maneuverable hypersonics. These are missiles that can not only fly at hypersonic speeds but can also maneuver while doing so, making them incredibly difficult to defend against. In this area, all three nations are still struggling to field fully operational missiles, but the US has made great strides in recent tests. One area where the US may in fact be coming up short is the development of advanced long-range air-to-air missiles. Recent photos of Chinese jets show that China has begun to field advanced beyond visual range missiles, while the US is still largely equipped with the AIM-120, an extremely capable and combat-proven air-to-air missile that nevertheless is only effective at medium ranges. However, the Pentagon's F-3R program aims to improve the capabilities of American air-to-air missiles by not just greatly expanding their range, but also improving efficiency in an electronically contested environment. A new generation of American missiles will feature two-way data links, GPS-enhanced inertial measurement units, an expanded no-escape envelope to increase lethality, and improved high-angle off-bore sight capability, allowing pilots to fire missiles without their plane being pointed directly at the enemy, thus lowering their vulnerability. However, the next step for US fighters is the AIM-260, which will feature beyond visual range capabilities and match longer-range opposition missiles while bringing the tried-and-true technologies of the AIM-120. But World War III will also likely involve action against Russia in Europe, as China and Russia are both likely to cooperate in such a scenario. This will be a partnership of opportunity, however, not of choice, as relations between the nations are difficult at best, and Russia grows increasingly frustrated at its status as the junior partner. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Russian military has proven itself incompetent, corrupt, and inept at executing a modern 21st century war. Despite vastly superior firepower, the Russian offensive in Ukraine has all but stalled out. And this is with Russian forces facing a foe that has a fraction the capabilities of the US military. Simply put, the only real threat Russia can bring to a global war scenario is their nuclear power. With the bulk of the US Army not taking part in operations in the Pacific, Russia would be easily contained by current US ground firepower, while NATO would be short on critical air assets. These are capability gaps easily filled in by NATO air forces. 4 months ago, we would have spent an additional 10 minutes explaining to you how the US is preparing to counter Russia. Today, after seeing what the Russian military is capable of, we honestly don't have to. While victory would come at a cost, NATO would most likely win a resounding victory over the Russian armed forces. The only real threat Russia would pose would be in the first few weeks as the bulk of American firepower is being shipped across the Atlantic and prepared for battle. This leaves the Baltics and Poland vulnerable, but the deployment of NATO rapid response forces would likely be enough to slow down an initial Russian offensive and greatly limit its gains until NATO's European partners can fully mobilize their own armies. U.S. strategy to counter Russian aggression in the next World War is thus based around preparing European partners to better defend their own continent and not be so reliant on the U.S. military, as the conflict against China will consume the bulk of U.S. sea and air power. The Pacific is where the real war will play out, and after its stunning losses in Ukraine, it's unlikely Russia would willingly engage NATO in a Third World War anyway. The war in Ukraine has proven one thing: the United States military would wipe the floor with Russia. No, we're not funded by the CIA, as many have claimed in the comments section. This is simple objective truth. Let's look at why. If you want to evaluate the capabilities of the two militaries, we must first understand the core philosophy of each fighting force. The Russian military has traditionally been a ground power with heavy focus on its army and artillery, with few warm water ports and almost none that would be immediately under threat from NATO forces. Russia and the Soviet Union before it held no illusions that they could become a major maritime power. Back when the US was fielding its first supercarriers, the Soviet Navy wanted to match the capability until they were reminded that to join the fight anywhere outside their immediate shoreline, they'd first have to run a gauntlet of NATO shore-based anti-ship missile batteries. Geography has not been kind to Russia's dreams of being a naval power, which is why it's never been a truly global power at all, period. This means that any future conflict involving Russia and NATO will most likely take place in Eastern Europe. The Russian military is well suited for that task, with the largest armored vehicle fleet in the world, which it has aggressively used to destroy Ukraine's stockpile of anti-tank missiles. Before the war in Ukraine, Russia had an estimated 170 battalion tactical groups, or about 119,000 ground combat troops, making it one of the largest ground forces in the world. It's in artillery where Russia truly shines, though, and it's been the only saving grace its military has been able to call upon. Before the war, Russia had over 10,000 artillery pieces and nearly 4,000 MLRS. Russia's reliance on artillery is not by accident. It knows full well that it cannot compete in the air against NATO powers, and thus has relied on ground-based fire support to ensure it can provide support for engaged infantry and armor. However, as Ukraine has shown, these numbers are impressive on paper, but far less so when the actual equipment is taken into account, as a significant bulk of this equipment is all from the Cold War and has not seen modernization upgrades. Also, a lot of it simply doesn't work anymore due to poor maintenance or storage or outright theft of critical components. Ultimately, Russia is a ground power meant to fight a war against the West and Europe. However, it's far from a modern professional military. Rampant corruption has hollowed out every single facet of the Russian war machine and made it an ineffective lumbering giant whose only real advantage is sheer mass. That works against a power like Ukraine to a degree, but it would never work against the American military. America basically won the lottery when it came time to spawn on the world map. It's the single most defensible nation on Earth, quite literally immune to invasion from a hostile power thanks to two giant oceans on each coast and a complete domination of its global hemisphere. This defensive advantage came at a significant cost. To project military power, America would need to first move that power thousands of miles east or west. And that's why the United States has always been a naval power since its creation as a state, when it struggled against the vastly superior Royal British Navy during the Revolutionary War with a handful of boats we'll generously call warships. However, by the dawn of the 20th century, the United States Navy was rivaling the Royal Navy in tonnage and expertise, and would surpass it in the interwar years as the most powerful naval force on Earth. This was all at the expense of its army, because when World War I and World War II kicked off, the US Army was a bit of a clown show. Enthusiastic almost to a fault, The British initially feared a total defeat in Africa when the US Army joined the fighting in World War II. However, under the tutelage of the Allied powers and cutting its teeth in combat, the US Army grew in proficiency, while its Marine Corps, a competent force throughout the early 20th century, would do some of the nastiest, dirtiest fighting on the planet against a fanatical enemy. America emerged from World War II with one clear lesson in mind: never again. Determined to be never second to any other power in the world, the US began to nurture what would become one of the most professional fighting forces in Earth's history. And to that end, it became a technological power, putting its considerable intellectual and engineering resources into developing weapons one or more generations ahead of any potential adversary. In the second half of the 20th century, the United States shifted from a naval power to a naval and air power, unmatched in either arena, with a growing emphasis on air power. Engineers like the late great Kelly Johnson ensured that in the skies America had no peers. Modern Russian military doctrine gravitates around the battalion tactical group, a formation of 600 to 800 combat troops made up of 2 to 4 companies of infantry, usually mechanized, and reinforced with air defense, artillery, engineering, and logistical support units. A tank and a rocket artillery company are typically attached to each BTG. The BTG is meant to operate as a combined arms maneuver unit and has the advantage of allowing for the use of support assets such as artillery at the tactical level. A relative lack of infantry, though, with only about 200 infantrymen per BTG, means that it's difficult for this formation to actually hold territory, and the Russian army relies heavily on Marines, paratroopers, or other units for the task. The fact that Russia is already looking to reorganize its BTGs is indicative of how well they perform against a near-peer adversary. Lessons learned in Ukraine are showing that the BTG is a more lumbering beast than agile, tactical, combined arms maneuvering unit. Though in truth, this probably has more to do with the quality of Russian soldiers, doctrine, and leadership than the composition of the BTG. One significant weakness of the Russian military is its ability to coordinate effectively. This has made the BTG a fundamentally flawed composition, as it decentralizes Russia's greatest asset, its artillery. Unable to coordinate its massive advantage in artillery, as big as 20-1 during the first 6 to 8 months of the war in Ukraine, and 8-1 on average today, Russia has had far less success in leveraging its only real overmatch against the far smaller and less equipped Ukrainian military. British intelligence indicated that as of November 2022, Russia was already starting to move away from the BTG concept. The U.S. Army's Brigade Combat Team is everything the Battalion Tactical Group tried to be, and more. A BCT can come in 4 flavors: infantry, striker, armored, and strawberry lemonade. BCTs are meant to be fully self-supporting units and deployable anywhere in the world for any mission that the U.S. Army requires of them. As such, they have various assets native to them. The infantry BCT is made up of about 4,500 soldiers and is organized around a core of 3 battalions of infantry. This already makes them significantly more powerful than Russia's BTG, as each battalion is made up of around 1,000 soldiers. However, this also means that the U.S. fields far fewer BCTs than Russia fields BTGs, with only 14 active BCTs in the U.S. Army. American infantry is either mechanized or motorized, deployed in Bradley infantry fighting vehicles or using HMMWVs or their equivalent replacement, giving the BCT an emphasis on high mobility. Alongside its infantry, a BCT will typically contain 1 recon cavalry battalion, 1 brigade support battalion, 1 engineer battalion, and 1 field artillery battalion. A Stryker BCT is centered around the use of the Stryker armored vehicle and is meant to plug a gap between the U.S. Army's light infantry and heavy armored infantry. It's also meant to be a very fast response unit, with an entire brigade being airlifted anywhere in the world within 96 hours and a division within 120 hours. Like the infantry BCT, a Stryker BCT is made up of 3 infantry battalions in 300 Stryker vehicles, 1 recon cavalry battalion, 1 artillery battalion, 1 brigade support battalion, 1 brigade headquarters and headquarters company, and 1 brigade engineer battalion. An anti-tank company made up of the mobile gun system variant of the Stryker directly supports the Stryker BCT against enemy armor. The Armored Brigade Combat Team is what the U.S. military sends when you've fudged around and it's time for you to find out. This is the armored fist of the American military, specifically designed to break the strongest of enemy defenses. The core of this formation is its 87 Abrams main battle tanks and 152 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. And an armored BCT can come in 2 varieties, with either 2 tank companies and 1 mechanized infantry company or 2 mechanized infantry companies and 1 tank company. As the US shifts away from its fighting insurgencies and the war on terror back to fighting near-peer adversaries, so too is its BCTs changing. The Waypoint 2028 program, later rebranded to Army 2030, is looking to fundamentally redesign how America deploys its battalion combat teams, with a focus on armor to face near-peer threats. This redesign aims to move artillery from the BCT to the divisional level, much the same as Russia is attempting to do, so that it can be better employed across a wide engagement front while also improving survivability in a heavily contested electronic warfare environment where communications may not always be guaranteed between units. Engineering units are also being reorganized to a divisional level for much the same reason. As has famously been said, war doesn't tolerate BS, and the American Battalion Combat Team has been put to the fire multiple times. Each time its superior mobility and coordination proved decisive, while Russia's smaller battalion tactical groups, ironically smaller and meant to be more maneuverable, have not been. This is largely due to training, leadership, and doctrine though. The biggest flaw with the Russian military is a lack of professional training and soldiers both. With a culture of abuse and corruption, the Russian armed forces have a difficult time retaining recruits, and only an estimated 2% of conscripts chose to sign an enlistment contract at the end of their mandatory service. This extremely high turnover rate means that the Russian military lacks seasoned troops, which form the backbone of any modern military, and directly leads to a crippling lack of non-commissioned officers. Before the war in Ukraine, Russia attempted to fix this by creating new training programs for NCOs and offering incentives for soldiers to re-enlist. As the war has shown, this has not been enough. Regular Russian officers have been forced to pick up the duties an NCO would, and senior officers have even been spotted leading platoon-sized actions. Inevitably, these senior officers get killed or wounded, further eroding the discipline and capabilities of the Russian military. If all the managers at a restaurant disappeared because they'd been killed, it'd be very difficult for a bunch of cashiers, cooks, and waitstaff to do the specialized tasks senior management is responsible for, such as ordering, handling pay and benefits, scheduling, etc. In effect, this is what's happening with the Russian military today. Its brain drain slowly attrits the forces, and every day the Russian military is in effect getting dumber, and that's really saying something. The United States, like every other modern nation, is having difficulty reaching recruitment quotas and retaining those already in service. Ironically, the US believed it would have difficulty recruiting during the lengthy wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it wasn't until the withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan that a true recruitment crisis occurred. Today, the US Army is short 25% of its needed recruits, with estimates putting the US Army down 7% of its current force numbers in 2 years. Other services aren't suffering as badly, but still face their own challenges, with only the US Marines coming out relatively okay thanks to strong retention rates. The US military is struggling to remain competitive versus a strong economy, and the lack of conflict ironically means that potential recruits don't see service as a critical nation need. And nothing could be further from the truth given the potential threat of conflict with China. COVID, however, has had a significant effect on the recruitment crisis, with an explosion of mental and physical health issues amongst the younger Americans who would normally fill out the military's ranks. Also, adherence to physical and mental standards disqualifies a large group of individuals from even considering service in the first place. And while the US could do like China and lower recruitment standards over half a dozen times, doing so would only result in subpar troops. Recruitment crisis and its implications for an all-volunteer force aside, the US military is worlds away from the Russian military in professionalism and education. Hazing exists, as it does in any major organization, but in the Russian army, this is actively encouraged rather than punished. Likewise, US troopers aren't stripping the wiring out of their vehicles to sell at a local market. A strong NCO corps ensures discipline and training standards are met, as well as an institutional system of oversight and accountability. Whereas in the Russian military, training is typically done only long enough for someone to snap a picture of it and send it up the chain as proof. There are multiple levels of accountability for US personnel, and unlike a heavily conscripted force, American servicemen generally want to increase their training and education. Education is something the US military takes very seriously, heavily encouraging personnel at all levels to pursue higher education by making it free. For senior personnel, the US also operates 5 world-class war colleges, which instruct American officers alongside officers from nations all over the world. For America, war is both a science and an art form. But the real difference between the two militaries is their very fundamental nature. The US military encourages, even instills in its personnel a sense of initiative. The Russian army does not. Russia continues to fight like its Soviet predecessor, with a heavy top-down command structure that discourages personal initiative. The US military, by comparison, encourages leadership at every level, from an individual squad leader to a senior general, to act on their own initiative after exercising good judgment. This makes the US a military of many potential leaders, insulating it from the combat attrition of command personnel. Meanwhile, we have plenty of evidence from Ukraine of entire Russian units paralyzed because of severed links to command staff. This glaring vulnerability of the Russian military is what originally prompted the US to develop the most lethal war doctrine to date, air-land battle, now evolved to sea-air-land battle. This operational doctrine is the core philosophy of how the US fights wars, and it was revealed to the world for the first time in the early 1990s during Operation Desert Storm. It's so frighteningly effective that it took even US military planners completely by surprise, sweeping aside one of the world's largest armies with absolute ease. Sea-air-land battle seeks to present an adversary with conundrums across the full warfighting spectrum to sow chaos and uncertainty amongst the enemy, opening up vulnerabilities and opportunities in one or more domains. To achieve this, the US has become a truly combined arms force, with ground, air, space, and naval assets tightly coordinated together via tactical data links, something Russia is still struggling with to this day. While Russia has coordinated its aerospace forces with ground-based air defenses, it's struggled to loop in its ground combat units to achieve what the US had long ago mastered: common engagement capability. This is the ability for one spotter to observe an enemy and guide another shooter's weapons to the target, and it's the secret behind the US's lethality. Unlike Soviet forces, which sought decisive battles with overwhelming force, the US specializes in launching deep strikes into enemies' rear areas, specifically targeting logistics and command and control, or C2 nodes. This is why the US has placed a heavy emphasis on its air forces, stealth, and standoff attack capability, as well as extreme precision rocket artillery, soon to be supplemented with ground-based ballistic missiles with extremely long ranges. While the Air Force is busy making a mess of the enemy's communications and supplies, ground forces strike at the enemy in smaller, more mobile formations that attack from a variety of different directions. This makes it difficult for the enemy to coordinate a defense, especially when their command and control has been disrupted or destroyed. A focus on rapid mobility and communications allows the US to quickly identify breaches in enemy formations and rapidly exploit them with overwhelming force. The US has basically adopted Muhammad Ali's famous adage of floating like a butterfly and stinging like a bee, and it's proven its mettle against numerically superior forces time and again. Now let's look at the specifics of what actually makes the US a superior force over the Russian military. Let's start with the basics. Communications. Communications is key to battlefield success. Without it, you can't tell your troops what to do and when to do it. Of all the investments in technology that the US has made, few surpass the untold billions that went into building the most robust, secure battlefield networks in the world, and they are the key to the US's success. Thanks to tactical data links, the Link 16 and future replacement Link 22, American units can freely swap information between each other. Even weapons en route to their target can speak to another, such as the new long-range anti-ship missile, which can deconflict when launched in volleys to ensure all missiles don't hit the same target, and can update target priorities as missiles in a volley are knocked out by enemy air defenses. But at the very basic level, secure communications allows the US to move units around and coordinate without letting the enemy be privy to this information. Russia does not have this capability. Immediately after the invasion began, frontline reports from Ukrainian troops revealed that communications amongst Russian military was very poor, with units often relying on unencrypted civilian radios or even cell phones. Russian strategic bombers, the very same craft responsible for delivering a retaliatory nuclear strike, were also recorded using unsecured communications. On paper, Russia is supposed to have secure, encrypted communications for all or at least most of its units. Russian soldiers have been observed using advanced radios such as the R-187P1 AZART and the R-162-5UN2, both of which were discovered on a captured Russian paratrooper after the failed Antonov airport attack. However, the fighting in Ukraine has shown that this is simply not the case, and one need only look at Russia's history of corruption to understand why. In 2021, senior military figures and the manufacturer of the AZART radio came under investigation for embezzlement. with millions of rubles meant to purchase encrypted radios for the military vanishing into the pockets of various officials instead. To make matters worse, as Ukraine gets better at pinpointing Russian communication, officers are moving further and further away from the front, to the point that Russian units have reported having to resort to cell phones to reach them and ask for orders. The general failure of the Russian officer corps aside, which cowardly moves to the rear as they send their own men to their death, going up against a technologically advanced foe such as the United States with unsecure communications, is its own death sentence. The US has made communications a top priority, issuing the ANPRC 148 to its combat units. In fact, communications are so important that units in the field will typically deploy with multiple backups, including radios for local traffic and long-range radios and satellite radios for emergencies. Embedded personnel such as Air Force combat controllers will have their own radios to communicate with overhead aircraft, waiting to bring the boom when asked. And they can even stream video directly from overhead assets to get a bird's eye view of the battlefield, taking advantage of superior sensors on US aircraft. If there is one flaw with US communications, it's that there are too many different radios, and efforts to consolidate them into a single system have so far failed. That hasn't stopped the US from throwing millions at the problem until eventually, hopefully, it goes away, something that it's exceptionally good at to a fault. The next significant difference between the two militaries' infantry is their equipment. Take a look at these two photos and see if you can spot the differences. Anyone who served in the ground combat role can probably spot them immediately, but don't feel bad if you can't. The differences are subtle, but make all the difference in the world, and makes US soldiers far superior to their Russian counterparts. Need a clue? Look at the helmets, specifically the front of the helmets. You might notice that Russian helmets have no mounts for night vision. Now look at the rifles and compare the rifles of the American soldiers with those of the Russian soldiers. Spot a difference? Most Russian rifles come with no optics whatsoever, while American combat rifles already have optics when given to the troops. Even more importantly, American rifles carry the PAC family of laser systems, which are critical for aiming with night vision. Russian rifles do not carry these. So even on the rare occasion that a Russian soldier might have night vision, which is estimated at 1 in 10 soldiers, they're unable to use their rifles while also using their night vision. By comparison, every single US soldier is issued night vision and the required laser targeting system with which to use it properly. Other key differences include the mass adoption of armored vests by the US military, while most troops who are lucky enough to be issued body armor in the Russian military are typically issued what are colloquially known as second-chance vests, poorly suited for stopping high-powered rifle rounds. US soldiers also carry supplemental equipment such as radios, gloves, knee pads, and eye protection. Russian soldiers largely lack these small bits of kit that can end up giving an edge to a warfighter. And we're not cherry-picking here. You're welcome to look up photos of US soldiers in action versus their Russian counterparts. While there are elite Russian units who have access to what is standard US infantry, the entire point is that this is standard for all US infantry. The US owns the night and prefers to run night combat operations to exercise its vast advantage in imaging over any potential adversary. But more importantly, the US invests heavily in making sure its troops have the right equipment for the job, and this extends to its combat vehicles. American optics are on the whole superior to their Russian counterparts, especially as sanctions kick in and Russia's denied Western optics or the components to build its own. New Russian tanks are being sent to the front with nothing more than gunner sights, significantly lessening their effectiveness against Western tanks being donated to Ukraine. By the way, Russia had invested heavily into developing a native capability to build advanced night vision devices. However, the entire affair collapsed in on itself when corruption inevitably took a massive bite out of the budget, and the officials overseeing the company set up to produce domestic night vision kit were discovered to be siphoning off funds for themselves instead. Now, when Russia needs it the most, it's unable to produce the specialized components required for night vision optics. The entire Russian military suffers from a lack of kit that would be considered standard in the US military. Russian aviation, for example, has only a few aircraft capable of providing accurate air support for ground units, as the bulk of its air fleet lacks the targeting pods necessary for the task. The US, by comparison, has hundreds of these aircraft and can basically bolt on a targeting pod to just about anything that you can think of hurling into the sky. An Abrams tank might not be very aerodynamic, but if it wanted to, the US could strap a targeting pod and a rocket onto it, and for its brief flight through the sky be capable of delivering accurate ground fire for friendly forces. Russia's inability to do the same was on full display during the famed Belgorod incursion by the Free Russia Legion and Russian Volunteer Corps, when a Russian Su-34 dropped dumb gravity bombs that missed their target by a generous few hundred meters or so. The differences between the Russian and American military are so significant that we could probably do an entire 60-minute episode on the topic. Matter of fact, if this video gets enough views, we'll do a part 2 and present even more evidence from Ukraine on how the United States would absolutely decimate the Russian military. And for anyone who still doubts this or thinks we're just shilling for the US, remember that in June of 2022, the US sent a dozen HIMARS batteries to Ukraine, and it absolutely wrecked Russia's day. If Russia has yet to eliminate a single of the now 30 or so estimated HIMARS in Ukraine, how exactly does it expect to cope with the 400 still in the US inventory? The Ukraine war is the biggest conflict Europe has seen since World War II, and it's the first to feature some of the newest weapons of the 21st century. But it's also made the United States military realize that it might not be up to the task of fighting a modern conventional conflict. Lessons learned from Ukraine are changing everything, from the way America fights to even redesigning some of its most well-known combat systems. The Ukraine war will soon have been raging for 2 years, as Russia continues to throw itself against the brick wall that is Ukraine. The once mighty former superpower, feared by the world, and widely considered the second most powerful army on Earth, is a shadow of its former self, and has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that Russia is far more bark than bite. But that doesn't mean that this has been an easy war, and lessons learned here indicate that nobody, including the US military, is prepared for a conflict of this scale. The first lesson the US learned is how voraciously modern war consumes stocks of weapons and ammunition. Both Russia and Ukraine are expending thousands of shells a day, going through nearly a full year's worth of production in just 1 month of fighting. The war between Russia and Ukraine has become a numbers game for Russia. Long believed to be a capable modern military power, Russia is instead forced to resort to brute force to attempt to break Ukraine's military. Meanwhile, Ukraine is in a race against time, employing superior Western weapons and a whole lot of determination to dismantle the Russian military before it can in turn bleed Ukraine dry. The race for supplies is in full swing for both sides, and it turns out that neither side is prepared for the demands of a modern conventional war. Russia, which began with a 20-to-1 artillery advantage, is now only conducting between 5 and 6 times more shelling missions than Ukraine. For its part, Ukraine's firing about 6,000 rounds a day, but it says it needs 10,000 rounds to break Russian lines. At its peak, Russia was firing a whopping 60,000 rounds a day and still didn't manage to break Ukrainian lines. German defense manufacturer Rheinmetall has estimated that Ukraine needs 1.5 million rounds every year. Nobody knows how many artillery shells the US has stockpiled away. That information is kept confidential in order to undermine enemy efforts. But we do know that the US has supplied over 2 million shells to Ukraine throughout the conflict. However, last year, the US was only producing about 16,000 shells a month, and Europe wasn't doing much better. New legislation in both Europe and the US aims to dramatically increase production capabilities, but those are going to take time. The US is aiming to make as many as 24,000 shells by the end of 2023 and 100,000 shells a month by 2025. Combined with current European production of 300,000 shells a year at the start of 2023, the Allies are a long way off meeting Ukraine's needs. And when looking at these figures, one has to keep in mind that not all of these shells can simply be shipped off to Ukraine. Each nation has its own needs for shells to use in combat operations, training, or simply stockpiling away for the next time Russia decides to do something stupid. And every Western nation is now expanding its reserve stocks in anticipation of another major conventional war. Meaning, in the best-case scenario, Ukraine could probably receive about half of what's produced every year. This puts Ukraine in a rather precarious position as the war grinds on, which is why the West has also been expanding access to alternative munitions, like cluster shells. These controversial munitions are especially effective against infantry in trenches, but widely denounced for their habit of leaving large amounts of unexploded ordnance behind that can pose a significant risk to friendly troops and civilians years after a conflict concludes. It should be noted, though, that Russia has been using cluster munitions since the start of the fighting, including even against civilian targets. We shouldn't allow ourselves to sink to Russia's level by any means, but one must remain sober and clear-eyed about Russia's historical willingness to resort to every imaginable depravity because they already have in just a year and a half of fighting. Whatever the official figure, the US clearly does not believe it has sufficient ammunition stockpiles, but even more importantly, it doesn't have the capability to produce more ammunition. Having deep reserves is nice, but artillery shells can age out after about 30 years. Even more importantly, a nation needs the ability to rapidly ramp up production of warfighting goods, and shells are amongst the most important goods. This is a critical deficiency that the US has been dealing with since the end of the Cold War, when the vast network of defense contractors were either driven out of business or consolidated into a handful of companies. Defense plants across the nation were shuttered, and very few of these were kept in any state of readiness to be reopened again in case of an emergency. On one hand, it makes sense. A military would rather have money for active capabilities like new tanks, airplanes, and equipment than for reserve capabilities like keeping arms manufacturers open and its employees paid without actually providing anything. But the war in Ukraine has shown that defense investments cannot be just for active inventory. Modern war is absolutely brutal and consumes resources at a truly apocalyptic rate. Going forward, defense investments must include investing into the ability to quickly ramp up manufacturing at a large scale. Currently, the US arms industry is basically a boutique shop that makes everything to order. Lockheed Martin only makes 156 F-35s a year, and only a part of those are for America's military, the rest are for its partners. Now, when specifically talking about artillery shells, the US future needs come with a very specific caveat. The fighting in Ukraine is not truly an accurate representation of what a major conventional war with direct US involvement would look like. The Ukrainian war very quickly turned from combined arms maneuver war to something more closely resembling the vast trench networks of World War I. This is due to Ukraine's inexperience and lack of capabilities to conduct combined arms operations. And while Russia has access to all the right equipment for it, its military is a clown factory. The US military, to put it bluntly, is incredibly lethal. This is not an accident. The US has invested significant resources into learning from its past mistakes and developing the best war colleges in the world. Official US doctrine is to present an adversary with multiple domain challenges simultaneously in order to stress and break their ability to respond adequately to all or any of them. And it's very well equipped, and most importantly trained, to do just that. US aviators regularly train to coordinate with ground forces, while planners exercise at deconflicting airspace for US ground-based air defenses, so Russia can continue winning the gold medal at shooting down its own aircraft. The emphasis is on maneuver warfare in order to keep the enemy off guard and avoid the strategic quagmires of the past. And just about every weapon in the US arsenal is designed for these combined arms operations. A war between the US and Russia would not devolve into trench-to-trench fighting simply because American all-domain capabilities are significantly more advanced than Russia's. This means that there's a very low likelihood of a war devolving into the quagmire that Ukraine's Eastern Front finds itself in. But that chance isn't zero. As a French parliamentary member recently said, "We believed we could do everything with airplanes," when referencing the West's lack of artillery shells. The US doesn't like losing conventional wars, but it really doesn't mind taking runner-up in unconventional ones, apparently. This means that while the chance of war devolving to an artillery duel is extremely low, the US wishes to be prepared. And to do that, it needs to dramatically increase both its reserve of shells and its capability to create new ones. But it's not just shells, because this war has been eating up other weapons at a prodigious rate as well. America has sent around 5,000 javelins to Ukraine since fighting began, and it's unknown how many Javelin anti-tank missiles it has left in its own stockpiles. But like artillery shells, America's looking to ramp up production here as well. About 50,000 Javelins are in service with the US and its allies and partners, which means in just a year and a half, 10% of the stockpile has been sent to an active war zone. In 20 years of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US expended 5,000 Javelins. So 1 year of conventional war has expended as many Javelins as the US needed in 20 years. Another lesson the US has learned from the war in Ukraine is that the next major war America fights may not be as permissive an environment to its high-tech weapons as it would like. When Russia launched its initial invasion of Ukraine, it waged a largely unreported but extremely effective electronic war against its victim. Russian electronic warfare platforms completely overwhelmed Ukraine's ability to coordinate and communicate. But they worked a little too well, and in typical Russian fashion, affected Russia's own abilities to the point it had to significantly curtail the use of electronic warfare. The initial expertise in EW was quickly diminished, though, as Ukraine regained its balance and Russia didn't have the upper hand anymore. What would follow is a conflict where Russia's significant EW capabilities were poorly used, though that doesn't mean that they haven't still had a significant effect. One of the first major aid packages from the US to Ukraine was thousands of secure radios to avoid the worst effects of Russian electronic warfare and help better coordinate the troops on the ground. The introduction of HIMARS was revolutionary, single-handedly making the famous fall counteroffensive of 2022 a stunning success. HIMARS uses GPS-assisted precision munitions, but as the war wore on, its effectiveness has been increasingly limited. Today, Russia is interfering with a large number of HIMARS strikes against its most sensitive targets, though it seems relatively unable to protect frontline troops from its devastating precision effects. Around May of this year, it became clear that Russia was doing a decent job of interfering with HIMARS strikes. By jamming the GPS signal the rocket uses, its precision was significantly reduced. This in turn prompted the US to rush to develop new software aimed at circumventing Russian jamming, and Ukraine and the US made striking at Russian Zytel R330ZH jamming stations a top priority. These mobile jamming units, however, can be difficult to identify and quickly eliminate, though a leak from the Pentagon showed that US officials were strongly pushing for Russian jamming units to become priority targets over pretty much anything else. Ukraine promptly deployed special forces behind enemy lines with the sole purpose of hunting these down and destroying them. The jammers weren't just causing issues for HIMARS batteries, but for other Western-supplied precision weapons like JDAMs and precision artillery shells. The developments in Ukraine have showed how vulnerable American smart weapons can be in a near-peer conflict, and prompted both the US and Britain to work together to develop new ways of protecting their systems from jamming or eliminating adversary jamming systems. 40 years ago, early GPS units were credited with the coalition's stunning success on the ground against Iraqi forces. It wasn't just the might of Western tanks and close air support, it was the ability to navigate with extreme degrees of precision across a featureless desert. The Iraqis thought it would be impossible to move large forces in this way and thus set up their defenses toward major roads, only to be hit in the flanks by surprise attacks from the deserts. The importance of GPS has only increased since then, but so have incidents of GPS jamming and spoofing. From Ukraine to the Middle East and the South China Sea, GPS jamming and spoofing has affected everything from militaries to civilian traffic. Base systems have developed a digital GPS anti-jamming receiver, which is quickly proliferating across Western militaries, but the US has banked on encode GPS tech to make its weapons resilient to jamming. Basically, GPS 3.0, encode utilizes a new type of signal to make it much more difficult for GPS signals to be spoofed or completely jammed. It'll be transmitted in the same frequency ranges as old GPS, but users will only need part of the signal to anonymously calculate their position. GPS 3 satellites will also be able to broadcast spot coverage and regional coverage, making it extremely difficult to disrupt an incoming signal. The war in Ukraine has accelerated the US's need to purchase anti-jamming equipment and jam-resistant add-ons in its arsenal, as well as the deployment of M-code. Unfortunately, satellite launches are significantly behind schedule, and the US won't be able to make full use of its new GPS tech for years to come. The US has been carefully analyzing Russia's failures in Ukraine, an exhausting job for whoever got it, and two major points of failure have become clear. The first is a lack of battlefield command and control, with Russian military leadership often far in the rear or simply not having the tools or capabilities to coordinate a large number of troop formations at once. The second major failure is a lack of initiative by Russian troops, and this is a result of two things: low morale and poor doctrine. The US prides itself on having a force that is extremely resilient to command disruption. Junior leaders at every level are encouraged to act on their own initiative, creating a military that is highly resistant to the type of decapitation strikes Ukraine is delivering every other day. Russia, on the other hand, is the opposite, with its military entrenched in old Soviet doctrine of a heavy top-down command structure. Troops do as the higher command tells them to, and if higher command doesn't exist anymore because the general used his cell phone to call home and then Ukraine responded with a Storm Shadow strike, then they do nothing. It's never been clearer to the US that it must maintain its competitive advantage by fostering the type of carpe diem attitude that's been its hallmark since World War I. Renewed focus on NCO and junior leader training attempts to insulate US command chains from decapitation strikes. And with the proliferation of electronic warfare and radio jamming, US units must be able to operate on their own while being out of contact for prolonged periods of time. This means more individual and junior leader training, and to counter the same morale problem that's plaguing the Russian military, the daily allotment of HUAs in the US military has been increased threefold. The Ukrainian war has shown that US combat vehicle design might be outdated as well, though, and it's been scrambling to correct that mistake. The greatest killer of tanks in Ukraine has been the anti-tank missile, with a combination of landmines and artillery being a close second. Tank-on-tank combat accounts for only a fraction of total tank kills, as the anti-tank guided missile has proven it is the king of killing tanks, especially if you have awful armor doctrine like Russia and don't properly support them with dismounted infantry. Most anti-tank missiles work by attacking the thin top armor of a tank, often penetrating the turret and delivering a shaped rod of molten metal which punches into the tank and does very unkind things to any crew in the way. The US has taken note of the way Russian tanks have been savaged by ATGMs and now believes that it's time for some significant redesign of the legendary Abrams tank. It might look like America's taking a page from Russia's book, except it was the US who originally pioneered the concept of a remotely controlled turret. This is what the Abrams might be bringing to the table in its next iteration, as it moves its vulnerable crew out of the turret and into an armored capsule at the front of the tank. All the way back in 1980, the US experimented with the concept, but because the height of technology at the time was the Sony Walkman, it was deemed too immature a concept to risk bringing to the battlefields of Eastern Europe. Thus, the US opted for traditional turrets on top of the Abrams. But that's changing as the US looks at the use of a remote-controlled turret once more. This would make the crew safer even from an anti-tank missile, as it moves them out of the likely path of penetration. It also means the US will have to adopt an autoloader, however, something that it hasn't wanted to do so far. But in the end, America might not have a choice, because even though the ATGM protective measures are becoming increasingly more advanced, the fact of the matter is that the Abrams tank is already too fat for its own good. And studies from Ukraine show that to be survivable, the tank as it is going to have to put on even more pounds. Modern Abrams tanks are already too heavy for safe transport on many different types of vehicles, and far too heavy to safely cross most bridges. Adding more weight for more protective measures simply isn't an option, but the Abrams might have to take on the weight of additional countermeasures by adopting a remote-controlled turret. Such a turret could be made much smaller than a traditional turret and be less well armored as there's no crew inside to protect. This would allow the tank to shed tons of pounds and come down to something a bit more manageable for US logisticians. Tank manufacturer General Dynamics already revealed its Abrams X program back in March 2023, featuring a remote-controlled turret that could be the future of the legendary Abrams. Ukraine has delivered one final lesson to the US military, and it's one with a significance so important that the US has taken unprecedented action to immediately meet the challenge. It's estimated that Ukraine uses up to 10,000 drones a month. This includes drones lost to anti-drone weapons and jamming, as well as suicide drones used to deliver explosive love letters to the Russian Ministry of Defense in Moscow. On September 20th, Ukraine launched the largest drone attack in history, using over 100 drones to attack Russian defenses and facilities in Crimea. The attack was a stunning success, with the drones drawing the attention of Russian air defenses and forcing them to expend their missiles. The attritable swarm then continued onto its various targets and opened up the skies for Neptune missiles to strike at the Russian naval HQ. From attriting enemy air defenses to recon and spotting for artillery, drones are the weapon of the war, and the US has realized just how critical these sometimes very small weapons are for fighting a modern conflict. Despite being completely overmatched in every category, Ukraine's advantage in drones has been one of its biggest saving graces, and it's used that overmatch to make life absolutely miserable for the Russians. Aircraft and radar systems worth hundreds of millions of dollars have been destroyed or severely damaged by $1,000 drones, and that's an economic exchange that no country can hope to win. The US has prioritized anti-drone weapons across the entire military. In any future conflict, it's inevitable that enemy agents will strike far behind the front lines using disposable drones. The B-2 bomber is the world's second most capable bomber now that its successor, the B-21, is operational, but it can easily be destroyed by a 3-ship flight of a $200 DJI drone equipped with explosives and launched from close to its flight line. Everything from multi-million-dollar aircraft and systems to civilian infrastructure is vulnerable to drone attacks, and point drone defense weapons are a critical need for the American military. But traditional point defense weapons use expensive interceptors, and that's simply not an option. Again, swapping million-dollar Patriot missiles for $1,000 drones is a quick way to lose a war. Instead, the US is turning to directed energy weapons, and it's already fielding the most powerful battlefield lasers in the world with more to come. But the drone itself is a weapon supremely useful not just to overmatched powers like Ukraine, but even the world's most powerful military. In a stunning announcement, the US Department of Defense announced the Replicator program, aimed at producing and fielding, quote, thousands upon thousands, end quote, of drones in the US military by 2025. That's just 2 years, and the US is expecting to have massive drone swarms not just in inventory but in active use. Drone swarms are supremely useful, as Ukraine has proven, and the US has named a specific adversary for its future drones: China. Citing China's growing number superiority in the Pacific, the DoD is turning to vast swarms of drones to level the playing field, and then tip it in its advantage. These drones will do everything from recon to saturating enemy defenses and even delivering suicide attacks. And Replicator aims to have vast quantities of expendable drones for use in both sky and sea. America is an apt pupil of war, and the Ukraine war has been a masterclass on the challenges of future combat and how ill-prepared in places the US and its allies have been. However, the advantage of the United States military over any potential adversary is its dedication to professional military education with the best war colleges in the world, where US service members attend class side by side with allies and partners from around the world. If the US is going to keep its competitive advantage, though, it's got to keep evolving and avoid letting any amount of hubris stagnate its military culture. A column of Ukrainian armored vehicles accompanied by tanks approaches their ready positions, prepared for a fresh assault into the Russian defenses outside Kherson. The Ukrainian counteroffensive has been wildly successful, beyond even the scope of the most optimistic military planners. Russia can't hold the line against Ukrainian grit and firepower, and its troops are on steady retreat across the entire Eastern Front. On Friday, September 30th, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin had annexed 4 regions of Ukraine, declaring them Russian territory. This now allows him to use all available means at his disposal to neutralize the Ukrainian counterattack. Now, with his back against the wall, Vladimir Putin becomes the second person in history to order the use of nuclear weapons in war. A brilliant fireball lights up the night sky, incinerating the column of Ukrainian vehicles. Even inside their armored shells, the Ukrainian soldiers are killed instantly. Those who were far enough away to survive the heat and blast are killed by the radiation bombarding their bodies. Several hundred Ukrainian soldiers and a few dozen vehicles are destroyed. The attack has been largely insignificant in terms of military value. Ukrainian forces have mastered the tactic of dispersing and reuniting again for sudden offensives, but it sends a clear message to Ukraine and the rest of the world. Thousands of miles above the planet, a United States satellite, part of the American Space Surveillance Network, detects the distinct double flash of a nuclear explosion. The alarm is instantly relayed via communication satellites using the secure Link 16 encrypted radio frequency system. Within 30 seconds of detection, the alarm has already reached a U.S. Space Force monitoring station in North America and similar offices around the NATO alliance. Minutes later, the alert reaches the desk of U.S. President Joe Biden. Picking up a secure phone, he dials a direct connection to General Mark A. Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the most powerful military officer on the planet. President Biden speaks only 3 words into the receiver: execute Plan 36. The coded order is relayed via U.S. communications satellite to Stuttgart, Germany, and the office of the commander of U.S. European Command, General Christopher G. Cavalli. Within minutes, the authenticated order is transmitted to U.S. forces in RAF Bentwaters and RAF Lakenheath inside England. A separate communique is dispatched to the USS supercarrier George H.W. Bush, currently stationed in the Mediterranean. The Bush is loitering in waters off the southern coast of Turkey, and the ship immediately turns into the wind as its flight deck erupts in a flurry of activity. Ever since Putin's threats of using nuclear weapons, the American military has been prepared to respond. Beneath the deck of the Bush, F-18 Super Hornets are having AIM-160 MALDs attached to wing hardpoints. Each Hornet can carry 2 of the large weapons, a capability kept secret from the world until now. 2 squadrons of the high-performance aircraft are quickly made ready and begin the journey to the flight deck above where they stand ready. In England, crews rush to man a fleet of 8 B-52 Stratofortress bombers. The big planes are the backbone of the U.S. bomber fleet and can bring a frighteningly large amount of firepower to bear thousands of miles away. Joining them are 4 B-2 bombers also kept on alert status, their crews ready to go at a moment's notice with bellies full of weapons. Within 15 minutes, the first planes are taking to the sky and turning southeast toward mainland Europe. 2 hours later, the bomber fleet links up with 2 squadrons of U.S. Air Force F-22 Raptors, taking off from bases in Germany. The Raptors are flying in stealth configuration, which means their wing pylons are clean of weapons. The internal weapons bay, however, is loaded with 6 AIM-120 air-to-air missiles and 2 AIM-9 short-range missiles in the side bays. The formation continues toward the Black Sea, the F-22s leading the way. An hour later, the F-22s link up with a loitering U.S. Air Force tanker aircraft in order to top off their fuel stores. The B-52s loiter as the F-22s refuel. With enough capacity to fly strike missions in Europe from their home bases in America, the B-52s have no need to refuel. As the F-22s refuel, NATO AWACS aircraft flying along the Ukrainian and Turkish coasts sweep the skies with their powerful radar, looking for any potential hostile targets that could pose a problem for the mission. The aircraft's powerful radar only has a range just above 250 miles, so they can only see across approximately half of the Black Sea. Soon they'll move for a closer look, but in order to maintain the element of surprise, the AWACS stick to their normal flight pattern instituted at start of the Ukraine war. The F-22's refueling, however, is the signal for the USS Bush to begin launching her Super Hornets. One by one, the high-performance strike fighters take to the sky, their compatriots wheeling in the skies above the carrier strike group and waiting until both squadrons have taken to the air. Then the planes split into two groups, taking similar but distinct routes north and into Turkish airspace. One route will take the group west of Ankara, while another will take the other group over Sivas. An hour later, both squadrons pivot northeast, heading straight for the Black Sea. The B-52s, B-2s, and F-22s have now reached the Black Sea. The United States operation to punish Russia for its use of nuclear weapons is a go. The B-2s take the lead now. The entire formation has turned south and then east again, which will allow it to skirt Crimea by 70 or so miles, well out of the effective range of Russian air defenses in the region. The target is Novorossiysk and the Russian naval base located there. After the sinking of the Moskva, the Russian Black Sea Fleet has moved its largest surface combat vessels here in order to keep them out of range of Western anti-ship weapons provided to Ukraine. The AWACS aircraft have shadowed the formation, sweeping the skies with their powerful long-range radar. The job is to look for enemy fighters, thus allowing the accompanying F-22s to operate without their own search radars on, ensuring their stealth. However, the powerful radar is being picked up by Russian sensors in Crimea. The Russians now know that an attack is coming. NATO hasn't deviated in any significant way from its pre-announced patrol routes for months, and the only reason an AWACS aircraft could be approaching Russian shores is if it's backing up a major air attack. It's not long before the AWACS planes pick up the signature of multiple Russian fighters taking to the skies. The data is relayed via data link to the Raptors, who stand ready to greet the Russian challengers. It's now time for the Super Hornets to do their part. Skirting along the very edge of Russian long-range radar, the Hornets fire off their MALDs one by one. In minutes, 40 of the big missiles are screaming straight at mainland Russia. But the weapons aren't bombs. The miniature air-launched decoy is an advanced drone that can perfectly replicate the radar return of nearly any aircraft in NATO's arsenal. Currently, the decoys are spoofing Russian radar returns to convince them a flight of B-52 bombers is incoming from the direction of Turkey, escorted by F-18s. This is a credible threat. The U.S. maintains multiple air bases in one of NATO's most geographically strategic allies. Payloads away, the Hornets turn around and head for the bush. Russian long-range air defense radar in Crimea has spotted the real B-52s, but the appearance of a flight of B-52s escorted by F-18s incoming from Turkey is a more pressing threat. Russian ground crews have been scrambling to put 3 squadrons of interceptors into the air. Now a squadron consisting of a combination of MiG-29s and MiG-31s are wheeling south from air bases in Crimea and the Russian mainland. The jets are in full afterburner mode, which consumes fuel at a frightening rate but pushes them to supersonic speeds. They must get to within 70 nautical miles of the incoming B-52s so they can intercept them with their long-range air-to-air missiles. The R-77-1s, NATO codename Adder, are inferior in range to their American AIM-120 counterparts, with only a range of 68 miles. This is roughly the range of the expected Harpoons carried by the American B-52s, who have a range of around 75 nautical miles. Russia always doubted the U.S. would respond with its own nukes, and this only left one possible target for American vengeance: the Russian Black Sea Fleet. An alert reaches the Russian vessels in waters just off of Novorossiysk. The fleet currently consists of the guided missile frigates Ladny, Admiral Essen, and Admiral Makarov, which has taken the role of fleet flagship after the loss of the Moskva. Landing ships Nikolai Filchenkov, Orsk, Azov, Novocherkassk, Cesar Kunikov, and Yamal are all at dock. The smaller guided missile corvettes Vyshny Volaichok, Samum, Ingushetia, and Graveron take up stations around the frigates. This is the bulk of the Russian Black Sea Fleet currently in operation, with a few vessels on duty in the Mediterranean. U.S. Navy submarines and F-15 Strike Eagles from Europe are already en route to destroy them. The entire fleet turns with their noses parallel to the incoming threat. This will allow each ship's CIWS systems maximum opportunity to engage any missiles that penetrate long-range air defenses. S-300 and S-400 batteries along Russia's eastern Black Sea coast open fire on the incoming decoys. The decoys are easily within the 242-mile range of both systems for targets with a radar return as large as a B-52. The number of incomings is overwhelming. This is a major American air assault, and the air defense batteries expend most of their missiles. The vessels of the Black Sea Fleet opt to let the shore units do their work and focus on defending against any aircraft or missiles which slip past. American B-2 stealth bombers open up with AGM-158C LRASM anti-ship missiles, the planned replacement for the Harpoon. The U.S. military still operates only a small number of the weapons and only recently adapted them for use with the B-2. Each of the 4 B-2s unleash a volley of 16 of these low-observable anti-ship missiles, and Russian radar screens light up as they detect the 64 incoming missiles. The attack is a complete surprise, and the missiles are moving so fast that shore-based air defense batteries have no chance of catching the missiles before they reach their targets. The fleet is on its own to defend against the attack, but the LRASM's low observable features making the missiles difficult to target. To make matters worse, their missiles now dive toward the ocean, flying just above the water as they scream toward their targets. The missiles are within several dozen nautical miles before Russian radars can not just detect them, but target them. The Russian ships immediately fire off decoys. These immediately begin to fire off electronic signals meant to be more powerful than those emitted by real vessels, thus luring in anti-ship missiles to strike them instead. However, the American missiles are built with optical target recognition systems, ensuring that the weapons can tell the difference between decoys and the real thing. At just over 36 miles, the Russian radars finally can target the LRASMs, and the frigates are the first to open up with long-range surface-to-air missiles. It's like trying to hit a speeding bullet with another bullet, and the LRASMs can be difficult to target. Of the 64 incoming missiles, 16 are struck and destroyed. With just miles left to go, the corvettes open up with short-range Komar missiles. These missiles have a much smaller warhead, but several manage to strike true. Another 8 LRASMs are knocked out of action. The American weapons now enter the terminal attack phase and suddenly pitch up, climbing high into the sky. More Russian anti-air missiles fly out to try to swat them out of the air. Another 6 LRASMs turn to fiery wrecks. Each missile identifies its own target, prioritizing the larger frigates. The sky fills with tungsten from the frigate CIWS systems. 10 more LRASMs are destroyed before striking true, but 22 find their targets. The 1,000-pound warheads slam into the Russian frigates. The Admiral Essen takes 10 of the missiles. She's already destroyed by the time the last 3 slam into her, but the missiles aren't smart enough to identify lethal battle damage. The Ladny only takes 2 and remains afloat with moderate damage. Admiral Makarov takes 6 LRASMs to the deck. The rest of the weapons either strike the smaller corvettes or explode in the water, missing their targets. Only 2 of the Russian frigates remain alive, along with 3 of the corvettes. 2 Russian ships are quickly sinking below the waves. The attacking B-2s turn around and head for home, visible on Russian radar only for a moment as each bomber opened its bay doors. To the south of the fleet, the Russian interceptors are now in range to engage the MALDs and open up with R-77 missiles, ripple firing at the incoming formation. Each missile will find its own target, and with such a dense concentration of forces, should have no problem striking true. The Russian fighters are rapidly turning and burning for home, fully aware that American AIM-160s have a longer range than them. The lead Hornet should have opened fire by now, yet strangely no incoming missile threats are detected on radar. Reporting this to ground control, Russian commanders are beginning to grow suspicious. A second wave of interceptors is redirected west toward the incoming flight of 8 B-52s. This happens to put them directly on course to intercept the B-2s, who are slow and vulnerable. In full afterburner, the Russian fighters will soon be in range of not just detection, but targeting of the stealthy aircraft. Right now, their focus are the big American bombers, who are completely vulnerable and helpless. Radar detects no accompanying fighters, which makes the Russian pilots very nervous. There are only 2 possibilities here. The 8 B-52s are actually decoys, and the main attack is the 40 aircraft formation to the south, or the attack from the south is the decoy, and this is the real thing. If the latter is the case, there can only be one reason why radar isn't detecting any accompanying fighters. The U.S. has put its F-35s or F-22s into the fight. The intercepting fighters get their answer shortly after entering the Black Sea. The F-22s have skirted out into the Black Sea and away from the shore, keeping out of range of shore-based radar, which can detect them within 100 or so miles. The Russian interceptors have even weaker radar and can only begin to pick up traces of the stealth fighters within 50 or so miles, but can only get good targeting locks from a few dozen miles away. The F-22s turn on their own targeting radar long enough to get a solid lock on the incoming Russian MiGs. On their radars, the Russians detect only a brief blip as each F-22 rapidly volley fires their AIM-120Ds. The AIM-120Ds have a classified range easily in excess of 100 nautical miles, and the MiGs don't even get to within range of the B-52s before they're forced to take evasive actions from the incoming missiles. Each missile has flown high into the sky immediately after firing, and now plummets down on the Russian fighters. Each pilot tries to notch the incoming missiles, but most of them strike true. The surviving fighters are forced to turn around at full afterburner, but the Raptors already have loosed another volley of aims at them to encourage them to retreat. The only way to defeat the American stealth fighters is to overwhelm them with numbers and absorb their long-range missile attacks. Once at close range, the Raptors would have been at a disadvantage, but the Hornet-launched decoys fooled the Russians into splitting their forces. With the skies free of enemy fighters, the B-52s are safe to get within 75 nautical miles of the surviving Russian vessels and loose their harpoons. 96 anti-ship missiles are soon screaming toward the Russian ships. The frigates immediately respond with their long-range air defense missiles. The harpoons are far older technology and don't have the same low observability features of the LRASM. Long-range air defense managed to take out 20 of the incoming missiles as the harpoons get within a dozen miles of the ships. Then the corvettes open up with their shorter-range missiles. Each ship is rapidly volley-firing their entire missile stock, knowing their lives depend on it. 20 more of the harpoons are knocked out before they get into range of the fleet Sea Whiz. Tungsten once more fills the sky as a wall of lead rises up to greet the incoming missiles. 22 more harpoons are knocked out either by missiles or Sea Whiz. Decoys manage to lure away a dozen or so of the harpoons, but 22 of the surviving missiles strike true. The 500-pound warheads smash into the corvettes and frigates, most of which have already been damaged by the LRASMs. Despite having half the warheads of the previous rocket volley, the blitz of missiles is lethal. As the B-52s head for home, Russia sends up more interceptors to take on the flight of MALDs to the south. The decoys are easily blown out of the sky by air and ground-based defenses, but all that does is expend precious resources Russia can no longer easily replenish. Their job is done. They succeeded in diverting Russian attention south and splitting up its interceptors. The Russian Black Sea Fleet has been destroyed. All that remains is 4 submarines which Russia doesn't dare put to sea for fear of being targeted, and a complement of landing and support craft. The surface combat vessels were the important targets, and Russia suffered an irreplaceable loss. In the span of an hour, it went from the dominant military power in the Black Sea to the weakest. Blockades of Ukrainian ports are no longer possible, and Russia has been punished for its use of nuclear weapons with the loss of hundreds of sailors and billions of dollars in hardware. What remains to be seen is if the deterrent has been effective, or if President Vladimir Putin will resort to even greater use of nuclear weapons as retaliation. If so, the United States stands ready with its allies to respond with either conventional or nuclear power. In World War I, the world was introduced to a new warfighting concept, modern combined arms warfare. By closely coordinating the use of artillery and infantry, both the Allied and Axis armies made effective use of a tactic known as the creeping barrage, in which artillery would strike just in front of the advancing infantry. As the infantry made its way forward, the artillery would adjust its fire using pre-planned timetables so as to avoid hitting friendly foes. The creeping barrage, first pioneered by the British, was a game-changer in many ways for the way the war was fought. Before this, artillery would be massed and fire on the enemy, killing many but allowing many more to seek cover in battlefield shelters. Once the barrage was over, the enemy would simply re-emerge and take up old defensive positions. The creeping barrage, however, ensured that friendly infantry would be ready the moment the bombardment let up, in order to take the enemy off guard and not give them enough time to get back to their defensive positions. The enemy thus had a hard choice to make: seek shelter and ignore advancing enemy troops, or fight off advancing troops while in the midst of an artillery barrage. The strategy of combined arms warfare further evolved in World War II, though this time it would be the Germans who shocked the world with their mastery of this concept. The German Blitzkrieg was a brilliant and extremely well-coordinated attack involving artillery, infantry, armor, and air power. By working together, all 4 elements could achieve far more than any single one could acting alone. The next big revolution in combined arms warfare would come from the United States as it fought its war in Vietnam. Given the difficult terrain, the U.S. adapted the use of airmobile infantry, which could be quickly deployed to any battlefield from nearby fire bases. In larger-scale battles, American armor would make contact with NVA forces, while close air support assets and even its brown water navy gave fire support. Air mobile infantry would then be dispatched to strike at the enemy's flank or rear. America's loss in Vietnam was ultimately not due to a military defeat, but rather a political one, as the will to fight collapsed in South Vietnam. Militarily, the United States had decimated both the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong armies, and the Tet Offensive was a last-ditch effort to intimidate the South to quit fighting. Unfortunately, it worked, and with the South no longer having the will to fight and domestic support collapsing, the U.S. was forced to return home. In the first Gulf War in 1991, the United States showed the world the power of modern combined arms warfare against a powerful adversary. At the time, Iraq had one of the largest tank forces in the world, and a very respectable air force backed up by one of the strongest air defense networks in the world, courtesy of the Soviet Union. In short, Iraq was no easy nut to crack. Yet, by using information warfare, electronic warfare, stealth assets, assets, naval bombardments, and close air support, the US and its coalition allies dismantled Iraq's defenses in a matter of days. After watching how well the branches of the US military operated together, the Russian Ministry of Defense famously stated that the only way to stop an American military thrust into Russia would be with the use of nuclear weapons. War, however, is ever evolving, and today, the United States faces a serious problem versus its projected future rival, China. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the United States military began to slack on research and development. There was, after all, no major threat to NATO and the democracies of the world anymore. When the global war on terror began in response to September 11th attacks, the US defense industry continued to shift its focus away from developing tools to combat modern and near-peer enemies. Now the United States faces a tactical situation where China is threatening to challenge it in the South Pacific, and the traditional technological advances it has long held against any adversary are quickly eroding. One sign of this erosion is the development of fifth-generation aircraft by both Russia and China. While Russia officially mothballed its fifth-gen program by announcing it would not be purchasing the plane in significant numbers, China has gone ahead with starting production on its J-20 stealth fighter. While the J-20 is widely acknowledged as an inferior copy of the F-35, which is no surprise as its design is based on stolen F-35 secrets, it still signals a huge erosion of the traditional advantage held by the United States. The biggest problem with maintaining an untouchable advantage against an adversary is that traditional weapon systems, also known as monolithic weapon systems, have an incredibly long development and acquisition process. The F-22 Raptor, for example, began its development process before the Cold War had even ended. While the plane was in development, the world had made 5 generational leaps in anti-air missile systems, with the latest being Russia's S-500 anti-air weapon system, which is without a doubt the best in the world. So the Department of Defense military planners face a sobering reality. Monolithic weapon systems take so long to develop and build that by the time they hit the battlefield, the tools to counter them have advanced by several generations. An anti-air missile system is, after all, much easier to develop than an entire stealth fighter jet. The same goes for ground platforms, though. A new tank is much harder to develop and research than a new anti-tank missile. Another major problem for American military planners is that all of these new weapon systems typically require long and complex kill chains in order to be effective. A kill chain is the different assets that are required in order to locate an enemy, identify it, relay targeting data, and finally service the target. This is made up of low observable drones, satellites, communication relays, and finally combat assets. And any break in this chain can render an entire weapon system completely ineffective. You can't hit what you can't locate or identify after all. And with defensive weapons typically being cheaper and faster to develop, complex kill chains are becoming ever more vulnerable to disruption. Kill chain troubles are affecting no nation more than China, which relies on a complex chain of assets in order to threaten the US Navy with its ballistic missile forces. While on paper, the thousands of ballistic missiles China has at its disposal seem like a deadly threat to the US Navy, the truth is that those missiles require an extremely complex and vulnerable kill chain of assets to even get close to hitting a moving target at sea. And China has not shown that it has the ability to protect its vulnerable kill chain from disruption by US forces, which is one reason that the American Navy respects but doesn't fear China's ballistic missile forces. With counterweapon systems and their fast evolutionary cycles threatening America's traditional high-tech monolithic weapon systems, Department of Defense planners knew they needed a new way of waging war. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency was quick to respond to this call to action. DARPA, for short, is world-renowned as the world's most advanced military think tank, and their sole purpose is to use the billions in funding they receive every year to brainstorm how future wars will be fought and to come up with new weapons to fight them with. Their latest development is nothing short of a revolution in warfare and a way to ensure that the United States maintain its untouchable fighting edge over any near-peer adversary. Mosaic warfare, as it's known, takes its name from the new nature of warfighting that it enshrines. Modern combined arms warfare can be thought of as a puzzle, with each system fitting into an exact place and connecting exactly with its neighboring puzzle pieces. When this method works, it works to stunning success, but modern weapons threaten to disrupt this perfect puzzle from being put together effectively. Mosaic warfare, on the other hand, makes use of weapon systems that don't have a set place in a puzzle, and thus can be cobbled together into any formation needed by warfighters on the ground. Mosaic warfare is adaptable, and instead of creating a kill chain of systems to destroy enemy targets, it creates a kill web of different systems that has built-in redundancy. Eliminate one strand of the web and the rest can still ensure that the enemy will get serviced properly. Mosaic warfare, however, relies on 3 new developments currently being tested in war games by the United States. The first of these is advanced military AIs that can help a commander on the ground sort through the realms of incoming data from various other battlefield sources. In one war game, the commanders of friendly forces were unable to exploit a massive technological advantage against the enemy because they simply couldn't make sense of all the data being fed to them by various unmanned weapons and recon systems deployed on the battlefield. This resulted in friendly forces resorting to conventional tactics, which cost a large number of lives to achieve the same victory that could have been achieved faster and with less lives lost if they'd been able to capitalize on all the battlefield intel. Military AIs now being developed to sort through incoming data, prioritize important data, and even make recommendations to commanders on the next course of action to take. The second development currently being field tested by the US military is advanced autonomous logistical systems. In essence, these are things such as battlefield 3D printing units, which can be pre-positioned via airdrop or brought along by friendly forces. The 3D printers can then create unmanned combat drones on the spot, or 3D print explosives for use against enemy targets. This would allow friendly forces to adapt to any combat environment and open up a host of tactical possibilities that would normally not be available. Rather than deploy with a set weapon package and perhaps one or two alternatives to serve as a target, an American combat unit could be deployed with a mobile 3D printing station, or simply meet up with one pre-deployed via aircraft and use it to develop entirely new weapon packages on the fly. The third development required for Mosaic warfare is the integration of electronic warfare personnel into rank-and-file combat units. In a signal-rich combat environment, knowing how to protect your electronic emissions is just as important as knowing how to disrupt those of your enemy. In DARPA wargame scenarios, units without skilled electronic warfare personnel fared much worse in combat encounters than those with. So, what does this all actually mean? What would Mosaic warfare look like versus traditional combined arms warfare? Well, luckily DARPA provided a ready-made example using a realistic and very possible future combat scenario. It's sometime in the mid-2020s, and tensions in the South China Sea have reached a boiling point. War between the US and China has finally broken out, and right now a platoon of American Marines are on their way to eliminate a Chinese radar installation located on a small South China Sea island. The Marines hit the beach and link up with a mission payload delivered just minutes before by an unmanned drone. The payload consists of a battlefield 3D printing station and raw materials needed to quickly print out anything from explosives to combat drones. As the grunts set up the printer, the commander checks in with his battlefield computer assistant, which sorts through the latest intelligence on the enemy target and helps weed out enemy decoys. The assistant recommends several plans of attack on the enemy installation, and the commander opts for the use of several scout drones to find and fix enemy positions, electronic warfare drones to silence enemy communications and stop them calling for reinforcement, and finally explosive suicide drones to strike enemy positions and clear the way to the target. Traditionally, the Marines would have to conduct their own recon and advance on the target based on intelligence that could be anywhere from a few hours to several days or more old. This would limit their avenue of attack against the target to a single direction, though the unit could be split up into smaller teams to strike from different directions, albeit risking that the smaller units will be destroyed by superior enemy firepower. Once more making contact with the enemy, close air support assets would have to be called in to deliver fire support, which would expose friendly pilots to enemy air defenses and give up the element of surprise altogether. Then a protracted firefight will be required to destroy the enemy defending the installation, and that's if the enemy wasn't packing any surprise that the Marines weren't expecting and perhaps not equipped to handle. Today, though, the Marines are able to 3D print several drones to augment their forces. The scout drones immediately set off through the treetops and circle the island, advancing on the enemy simultaneously from different angles. Upon successfully fixing the enemy's location, electronic warfare drones then zip to enemy command and control nodes and begin to jam them, opening up for an attack by the explosive suicide drones, which eliminate enemy fortified positions and armored vehicles. The Marines then advance on the target to finish the fight and destroy the enemy installation. At its core, Mosaic warfare is all about giving the battlefield commander more options with which to engage a target, and eliminating the risks posed by traditional weapon systems, which more and more readily can be easily hard countered. Mosaic warfare aims to make American troops more versatile, more adaptable, and thus fight battles on their own terms, forcing the enemy to fight on its back foot. In an age where traditional weapon systems no longer provide the technological superiority they once did, Mosaic warfare aims to restore America's warfighting dominance by shifting to low-cost, adaptable technologies that the enemy will never see coming. Vladimir Putin is sitting in his office, his top lip curled into a snarl. He's just been given his armed forces tanks inventory. The losses are staggering. The Russians were losing about 5 tanks a day earlier in the year, but it increased to 10 tanks a day after Ukraine's counteroffensives in the east and west. Legions of T-72s, T-80s, and T-90s have been destroyed. It's a nightmare for Putin. To suffer losses like that, the opposing side must have formidable weapons. As luck would have it, Ukraine has no shortage of them thanks to the West. The U.S. providing aid to Ukraine is hardly anything new. The Ukraine-Russia-U.S. story is a long and complicated one as to how these nations have interacted with each other, overtly and covertly, in recent years, and long before the war. U.S. help has been there for the right people for a while. Russia has also grown its influence in Ukraine, and it's been that way, well, for a long time. In 2014, the U.S. helped overthrow Ukraine's elected president, with Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland even being caught on the phone handpicking a new Ukrainian leader. So when we talk about U.S. aid to Ukraine, it's a convoluted story going back way before the Russian invasion. The tale has many sides, which anyone paying taxes should arguably understand. The Russians have repeatedly said that the U.S. has been dictating things behind the scenes, which has resulted in what they say is nothing more than a proxy war. The U.S. has accused Russia of flagrant abuse of powers. Up until recently, Ukraine didn't take that much newspaper space, and when it was talked about, it was often in a positive light. Corruption and neo-Nazis often filled the stories. Now, Putin is using neo-Nazi propaganda as justification for the invasion. There's the so-called realist account, as provided by the American political scientist John Mearsheimer, who believes the U.S. has orchestrated the war for its own selfish reasons, pushing the world closer to a nuclear catastrophe. Mearsheimer doesn't get invited to many parties these days. He hasn't been on CNN for eons. Holding that view can make you a lot of enemies in the US and Ukraine. It'll get you called a Putin propagandist, especially when you say something like Mearsheimer told The New Yorker recently, "We're going to blame the Russians, so we invented the story that Russia was bent on aggression in Eastern Europe." Mearsheimer is just one of the many vastly unpopular political experts who think the US has been pulling all the strings to cause havoc to Russia. They still think Putin is wrong, though. They still blame him for what he has done. You'd have many more friends if you espoused another view, the corporate media view for the most part, which is that Putin won't stop until he's satisfied that Russia is as great as it was in the past. That Putin is the epitome of evil. He's out of control. He won't stop until Russia has built a new Russian empire, which is why he needs to be stopped, which is why Ukraine needs billions in aid paid for by all you taxpaying citizens. So, in some sense, this is why the US can give so much aid, and for the most part, its citizens are okay with it. It's the same in other countries such as the UK, even if it is struggling right now. Today, we're going to talk more about how the US is aiding Ukraine in the practical sense, and we'll leave out all the small print of the why part. Neither will we try to understand what Vladimir Putin is thinking. We will just say this, though. We don't want to celebrate weapons and war. We don't want to make this show sound like weapon worship. The biggest losers in this conflict are the soldiers dying on both sides and the civilians suffering in large numbers. We only hope they'll find some amount of peace soon. As you'll see at the end, this could be wishful thinking. When you get to that end, if you pick a winner, you'll probably say the arms industry, the BAE Systems of this world, the Lockheed Martins, the Northrop Grummans, the Raytheons, their shareholders are also winning, which happen to include some members of Congress and some members of the UK Parliament. You can't ignore that either when it comes to aid. Over $100 billion in aid to Ukraine has been spent so far by all countries, but expect that to shoot up as the weeks and months pass. Most of it has been and will be military aid. It's not all about weapons, though. It's about food, clothing, infrastructure, and more. This is humanitarian aid, after all. If you add up all the aid provided by the US, the New York Times says the package is $54 billion, but that was back in May. Things have changed since then, as you'll soon see. Still, that number is more or less correct. Just to put matters into perspective, last year the U.S. government spent $43 billion on highway grants, $63 billion on public housing, $260 billion on education, and $56 billion on health insurance premium tax credits. You might now think the U.S.'s $54 billion is an immense amount, but in terms of their GDPs, Estonia, Latvia, and Poland have spent more than the U.S. on Ukraine aid. In order, Lithuania, the UK, and Canada came after the U.S. In terms of U.S. aid, $12.5 billion has gone to providing weapons or other supplies, $9.4 billion has gone to economic aid, and $6 billion on military and security assistance, $7 billion to food assistance and healthcare, $4.7 billion on grants and loans for military supplies, and $8.1 billion on military deployments and intelligence. It's surprising how many countries are helping out Ukraine. The number is around 50. We bet you didn't know that Argentina has just sent 1,700 tons of foodstuffs, medicine, and clothing to Ukraine. Bulgaria has also just sent over 2,000 helmets and 2,000 bulletproof vests. But tens of millions in aid is coming from many other nations, and for the wealthier ones, the aid is in the billions. France has sent Ukraine some top-notch military equipment, and we're talking about enough weapons and machinery to start a small war. It's the same with the UK. It sent a whole host of weapons to Ukraine, including thousands of anti-armor weapons and Javelin anti-tank missiles. It spent $54 million alone on Ukraine-bound Black Hornet nano drones. God only knows how they'll be used. We told you business was booming for the arms industry. Revenues have shot up, records are being broken as heads, legs, and chests are blown asunder. The profits of the people that make it possible have literally never been so good. In terms of raw numbers, the US is not only the biggest aid provider to Ukraine right now, followed by the UK, Poland, and Germany, but it's the biggest provider of military aid to nations worldwide. While humanitarian aid pales in comparison, the US is also the world leader in that regard. $8.2 billion for 2021, followed by Germany at $1.8 billion, the EU at $1.5 billion, and the UK at $840 million. The US's military aid comes from the budget of the Department of Defense, which, as you know, is a huge budget. It's $722 billion for 2022, and the DoD has requested that to be raised to $813 billion for 2023. The U.S. defense budget started to increase drastically in 2001 when it was $331 billion. In 2005, it reached $533 billion. It wasn't even $100 billion in the late 60s and early 70s when the U.S. was fighting in Vietnam and secretly bombing the hell out of Laos and Cambodia. Still, in terms of inflation, the 1969 defense budget would be $679 billion in today's money. We'll talk about some new numbers soon, but first, we need to ask how the U.S. actually sends so many weapons to Ukraine. We mean in logistical terms. The answer is twofold. One way is by air. For instance, the U.S.'s giant air transport planes can transport an insane amount, with the Super Galaxy being able to carry 130 tons of equipment. That means you could pack it with 2 M1A2 Abrams main battle tanks, or as many as 10 armored vehicles, or perhaps 16 high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles, aka Humvees. Having a few military transport planes flying every week will help, but in August 2022, the Washington Post said the Pentagon was expanding its use of maritime shipping. The Pentagon obviously won't say what routes those ships will be using, but did say that many of the weapons will go straight to Ukraine, while others will add to stocks already in other European countries. We guess you can now see why Russia has been losing so many tanks. It seems the entire world has Ukraine's back. Even China, which some say is taking the side of Russia, has remained neutral and isn't sending Russia any military aid. The bad news, or the very worst news, would be if things got nuclear, because Russia could hold its own. That's scary, and some analysts don't count out nuclear war. Now let's look at some of the weapons the US has already sent to Ukraine. At the top of the list, we'll put the 1,400 or so Stinger anti-aircraft systems. Anti-aircraft weapons have been very useful and have already taken out a number of aircraft on both sides. On October 1st, an anti-air missile shot a Russian Ka-52 attack helicopter to pieces in Zaporizhia Oblast, but we can't say exactly what weapon was used. The US has also sent about 8,500 Javelin anti-armor systems. News reports tell us that these things have been partly responsible for all the damage to Russian tanks that we talked about in the intro. Raytheon and Lockheed Martin have been busy making these things, while the US sent around 32,000 units of different types of anti-armor systems. The list of weapons goes on, but let's just mention a few more things that have been sent already. One package included 20 Mi-17 helicopters. On top of this, there were 200 Max Pro mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, 8 National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, hundreds of armored high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles, and 200 M113 armored personnel carriers. Then you have things such as counter-unmanned aerial systems, air surveillance radars, patrol boats, night vision devices, thermal imagery systems, satellite imagery systems, cold weather gear, electronic jamming equipment, explosive ordnance disposal protective gear, and much more. It's still not enough, according to the US media. Some more recent items talked about in the media that we think are part of the $54 billion budget include artillery and coastal defense weapons, ammunition for the artillery, and a bunch more advanced rocket systems. Now, we imagine you can really understand Russia's tank problem. Analysts are saying that the recent losses for Russia have been nothing short of astounding. On October 19th, the country lost 1,392 tanks, 801 were destroyed, and the rest were just abandoned or were taken without being hit. Ukraine has also lost tanks, but not anywhere near as many. We should also add that Russia hasn't reported its losses, though the news comes from the Western media. Never mind how cynical you think it sounds, you should always question what's reported in terms of wins and losses in wars. Throughout modern history, the numbers have been cooked up with propaganda to placate and buck up the public. We're not saying that's the case here, but just bear that in mind. Russia will be doing the same, of course. It doesn't help that Russia has been using tanks from the 60s and 70s. The T-62 is so old that one of the abandoned tanks was found and inside it someone has written, "I hate Nixon." Just kidding, but you get the idea. Modern tanks are far less exposed than older ones. According to Forbes, Ukraine now has quite the collection of captured T-62s. As for what Ukraine wants more of, not long ago it put in a request for high-mobility artillery rocket systems. These things, which will set you back about $3.8 million apiece, come from Lockheed Martin, are incredibly useful despite some reports of civilian casualties. Some members of the Taliban might also have been hurt, of course, although according to the International Security Assistance Force, the rockets were 300 meters off their targets. Despite the misses, military experts called HIMARS indispensable, or as one website said, combat-proven all-weather 24/7 lethal and responsive weapons. And that's why Ukraine has them on its Christmas list. As part of that same package, the U.S. said it would also send some M777 howitzers, 18 of them, each weighing in at $3.7 million, created by the British company BAE Systems. Recently, Ukraine said it needed longer-range weapons since Russia already had them. Obviously, it doesn't help if the enemy can hit you from further away. A Ukrainian presidential advisor explained it's hard to fight when you're attacked from 70 kilometers away and have nothing to fight back with. Ukraine can return Russia behind the Iron Curtain, but we need effective weapons for that. The BBC reported in September that the U.S. had agreed to send new aid, this time amounting to around $2.7 billion. The BBC said the package would include howitzers, munitions, Humvee vehicles, armored ambulances, and anti-tank systems. Again, we can't tell you if this is already part of the $54 billion aid package or a bit added to it. We say a bit. $2.7 billion is hardly just a drop in the ocean of blood. It was agreed anyway, without much opposition at all. As usual, the added money was greenlit by both sides of the U.S.'s political divide. This war and the attendant aid is about the only thing Democrats and Republicans can agree on for the most part. This is another reason why the aid can keep flowing. No one's against it, although not everyone feels the same about the situation. As you might know, former presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard just left the Democrat Party. She's taken an anti-war stance and just called the Democrats an elitist cabal of warmongers. She's in a very small minority of U.S. politicians, and if you look at her Twitter page, half the public likes to call her a traitor. The highly critical Noam Chomsky take on the U.S. foreign policy is not exactly embraced these days by the leaders of the free world. At a sprightly 93, Chomsky's no fan of both sides of U.S. politics in their present guises. He'd prefer real diplomacy to happen in Ukraine, which might not happen anytime soon. No one in their right mind would be a fan of Putin, so you have to wonder how this will all end. Endless war seems to be in the cards. If any entity is thrilled about this, it's the military-industrial complex, not the actual people fighting and dying. In an interview, Chomsky recently talked about the utter incompetence of the Russian military, but he issued a warning about the Western media narrative, saying, "Whenever there is a virtual unanimity on complex and murky issues, something is afoot, something is missing." Another former war correspondent and journalist said, "We are either looking at endless war or a potential nuclear holocaust." This will likely mean that next year there will be more billions in aid, which, short of everyone shaking hands and making some deals, is the best outcome. The other outcome is the end of the world as we know it. Millions upon millions dead. How do we ever get to this? Again, that's a long, difficult story that's more complicated than some narratives suggest. This is a show about aid, but what does aid mean? It means death and destruction, so fittingly we'll leave you with a sobering reflection from Chomsky. Unless the great powers find ways to accommodate and confront the most important threats that have arisen in human history, environmental destruction and nuclear war, nothing else will matter, and time is short. The United States has a problem. The Chinese Navy has officially become the world's largest navy. Thankfully, the capabilities of the Chinese Navy are decades behind that of the American Navy, but in any confrontation with China, the U.S. Navy will at best only be able to call upon 60% of its fleet, thanks to naval commitments elsewhere in the world. When forced to face off against just over half of the U.S. fleet, the Chinese Navy's chances for victory in any Pacific conflict quickly escalate. For now, though, the U.S. Navy doesn't need to worry. China is still not a true blue-water navy that's capable of operating for extended periods of time far away from its own shores, although it has sent task forces to the Horn of Africa to aid in anti-piracy efforts. Overall, on a ship-to-ship basis, the Chinese Navy's technology ranges from a decade to 4 decades behind the United States, especially amongst its very noisy submarine forces. Yet the situation is quickly changing. China has in recent years funded a major investment in its naval forces, which has resulted in a frenzy of shipbuilding. Currently, China outbuilds the United States when it comes to ships. Though again, it's important to remember that the capabilities of each ship so far fails to match up to those of American ships. Also, this is still the initial surge phase of China's new modern navy. After reaching a predetermined target number of ships, the shipbuilding frenzy will slow to a rate similar to the US's. China's growing naval might is worrying not just the United States, but many of China's own neighbors who have routinely been bullied by China's growing might.
Japan, the Philippines, and Vietnam, to name a few, all have serious disputes with China, which has on numerous times claimed territory rightfully within their territorial waters for itself. China's frenzy of island building in the South China Sea has also sparked international concerns, and while President Obama's shifting of naval power to the Pacific quickly halted the island expansions, China has so far refused to vacate the 5 islands it has built. This is in spite of a ruling by The Hague which dismissed China's fanciful claims to the region. Instead, China has fortified its South China Sea holdings, adding radars, flight lines for combat planes, and missile defense systems. The message is clear: China is not budging. While the U.S. is not seeking a military confrontation with China, its commitments to defend many of the nations that China is currently bullying or intimidating may force its hand. In that case, the U.S. may find itself with its hands full dealing with Chinese naval and ballistic missile power, unless radical reforms of the American Navy take place. The greatest threat to American naval forces in the Pacific is China's staggeringly large stockpile of anti-ship ballistic missiles. These giant missiles can be fired from the heart of China and guided to their target as far out in the Pacific as Guam by a system of space and airborne radar and targeting assets. With thousands of these missiles, the U.S. fleet appears to be in serious jeopardy. To counter the ballistic missile threat from China, the U.S. Navy has adopted a doctrine of dispersed operations. While in the past, battle groups would be centered around an aircraft carrier to fight relatively close together, the new doctrine has led the Navy to widely disperse its battle groups so as to make each individual ship harder to hit. New investments in anti-ballistic missile systems have also added robust capabilities to American fleets, and a new generation of anti-missile missiles have performed very well in testing. Yet a major problem for the U.S. Navy is the sheer number of ballistic and conventional missiles China could throw at American ships. While it's highly unlikely that China would be able to achieve air superiority against the U.S. Navy, new extremely long-range anti-ship missiles would see China fighters able to use their weapons against American ships from hundreds of miles away and never even get close to American interceptors meant to protect their ships from this threat. Then there's the threat posed by Chinese submarines, which could fire off anti-ship missiles while lurking under the waves. They would need to be closer to their American targets than Chinese jets, but would still be able to operate far outside of the traditional security envelope established around American battle groups. One solution to these twin problems is to simply push out the radius of the security envelope around a battle group. Unmanned refueling tankers are already being deployed amongst American fleets, and this will allow a carrier's combat air patrol to operate much further away than normal, which will let them intercept Chinese aircraft before getting close enough to fire. To counter the submarine threat, the U.S. Navy, under its Ghost Fleet Overlord program, has been testing autonomous ships that can assist manned ships in combat. One of these ships is an anti-submarine warfare platform, which would patrol the waters around a battle group completely on its own, searching for Chinese subs and engaging any discovered. Another key to defending American ships in the Pacific is a heavy investment into technologies and tools to disrupt China's kill chains, or a chain of assets required to successfully launch a ballistic missile and accurately guide it to its target 1,000 miles away. This includes space-based and airborne surveillance and radar platforms, as well as communication nodes, and while details remain classified, the U.S. so far remains confident that it can disrupt China's kill chain capabilities enough to protect most of its ships. For their part, the Chinese have never demonstrated they have the sophistication to implement and protect a kill chain system that can successfully target and destroy a ship far out at sea. New plans are calling for a heavy investment by the U.S. in anti-ballistic missile systems, such as directed energy weapons and kinetic interceptors such as railguns. Currently, one of the biggest problems with protecting American fleets is not an inability to accurately target and destroy incoming missiles, but simply that China would rely on overwhelming barrages meant to force U.S. ships to expend all the missiles in their batteries trying to protect themselves. Once each ship's battery is depleted, it is for all intents and purposes defenseless against incoming missiles, especially of the ballistic variety. A directed energy weapon would have no magazine size limits, as it would fire off electrical power generated by the ship. It could fire for as long as the ships generate electricity and intercept incoming missiles at the speed of light, making it incredibly accurate. High-energy lasers could burn out missile warheads and guidance electronics, causing them to prematurely detonate or simply fly out of control. Kinetic railgun interceptors would still need a magazine of projectiles, but these projectiles are both much cheaper to produce than a modern missile and can be made much smaller. A single railgun battery could hold hundreds of rounds for a fraction of the cost of a traditional vertical launch cell on a big warship. But even those innovations aren't enough to successfully defeat China at sea, because the fact remains that China has invested extremely heavily in both anti-ship ballistic and traditional missiles. To make matters worse, the U.S. Navy's current ship designs are only making China's job of destroying them easier. For decades, U.S. ships were built around extremely powerful suites of radar and other sensors, which gave them incredible situational awareness and command of their battle space. But in a modern war also make them incredibly easy targets to find for any sophisticated foe, such as China. In essence, U.S. ships and their sensor systems put out so much electronic noise that finding them out at sea would be easy for China, as it would be for you to find a screaming person in a pitch-black room. High-energy sensor systems are an absolute necessity for any naval force, so simply doing away with them is not realistic. Instead, the Navy needs to seriously rethink its current force structure. At the moment, the U.S. Navy is very destroyer and cruiser heavy. It's the biggest, meanest guy on the block and packs the strongest right hook in the world. To defeat China and not suffer catastrophic losses in doing so, the American Navy needs to go on a serious diet and slim down. Rather than relying on traditional concentrations of big destroyers and guided missile cruisers, the U.S. Navy needs to slash funding for those large ships and invest in a force of mid-range ships about half the size of a modern destroyer. These smaller ships would carry less ordnance, but would be cheaper to build, maintain, and operate, and could be fielded in large numbers versus smaller numbers of bigger ships. These medium-sized ships would be widely dispersed across a battle space, and thanks to their sheer numbers and smaller profiles, enough of them could get close enough to Chinese forces with an acceptable degree of risk that they could take advantage of passive sensors to track and target Chinese ships and shore targets. Passive sensor systems put out much less energy than active systems, and thus a larger network of smaller ships could relay targeting data back to the main battle group, while remaining relatively undetected. America's big guns could safely remain undetected at sea and still be able to service targets accurately. New studies call for these smaller ships to be completely unmanned, or at least optionally manned with crews no greater than 24. In fact, the U.S. Navy is looking to adopt unmanned ships in a big way, literally, and the service is right now testing 2 large unmanned ships. Under program Ghost Fleet Overlord, the U.S. Navy intends to build several large unmanned vessels, or LUVs, to support its traditional manned forces. The goal of these LUVs will be to offset the risk of battle groups being overwhelmed by saturation strikes and expending all of their missile batteries in self-defense. In essence, each LUV will be nothing more than a seaborne missile battery, housing hundreds of missiles, which could either be fired remotely at targets or used to resupply battle groups at sea. Nicknamed arsenal ships, the concept dates back to the 1980s, and each individual ship could carry about half the firepower of an entire battle group. That's a hell of a lot of punch in just one ship, but many experts fear that that's exactly the problem. These big robotic missile ships will still rely on extremely powerful active sensor systems that will be easy for Chinese forces to spot and target. Arsenal ships also have one other major downside. They serve no purpose outside of an actual war. Unlike traditional manned ships, arsenal ships could not be deployed on training missions, relationship-building missions with a friendly country, or counterterrorism missions. They would have only a single use, in only a single scenario, giving the Navy a lot less bang for its buck dollar for dollar. Instead, experts are calling for the Navy to switch from large robotic arsenal ships to the fleet of smaller unmanned or optionally manned ships we discussed earlier. Not only will this give the Navy a much greater survivability against Chinese missile forces, but the ships could still carry out a range of peacetime missions as well. In fact, a recent study showed that for the same price, the U.S. Navy could actually get 1.4 times the missile tubes going with a fleet of smaller ships than the current plan to purchase lower numbers of big robot arsenal ships. In the end, hopefully the Navy never needs to implement any of its plans to defeat China at sea, as nobody wants to see a confrontation between the two nations. Yet, for the U.S. and many of the South Pacific nations that have found themselves bullied by China in the last decade and a half, it's a comforting thought to know the U.S. Navy is always preparing for that unfortunate happenstance.
For decades, the world hung on the brink of nuclear annihilation, and despite the certain total destruction promised by nuclear war, military planners in both the United States and the Soviet Union sought ways to come out ahead in a potential exchange. Some of these plans were based on completely unrealistic assumptions. Others might have had a chance of success in a real nuclear exchange. What was overwhelmingly certain, however, was that in nuclear war, losses on either side would be staggering. But just how did the U.S. military plan on fighting a nuclear war? When you hear the term nuclear war, you probably think of an all-out exchange and the end of civilization. And this is certainly a likely outcome. Yet nuclear war isn't as cut and dry as a single full exchange scenario. And both the Soviet Union and the United States knew this. Nuclear weapons were extremely useful for both sides. For the United States, it offered a way to neutralize the Soviet Union's massive numbers advantage against it. For the Soviet Union, it was a way to neutralize the United States' technological edge. Both sides had plans for nuclear weapons and even a conventional war. And some local commanders on both sides even chafed
at the need to seek higher authority than themselves to use nuclear weapons. President Eisenhower initially believed that nuclear weapons were no different than any other bomb or bullet the military used and saw no reason why they couldn't be used against dedicated military targets. However, as nuclear weapons grew in destructive potential and their use proliferated to the Soviet Union and other nations, he very quickly changed his mind. However, what did not change was the possibility of using them against strictly military targets. In Europe, the US military planned on using small tactical nuclear weapons against Soviet armor and infantry forces. While technologically superior and better trained, US and NATO forces were vastly outnumbered by the forces of the Soviet Union and its Soviet bloc allies. Both sides knew that tactical nuclear weapons were the only chance at stopping the Soviets from washing across Europe like a giant tide. For this purpose, battlefield commanders would briefly be authorized to launch limited nuclear attacks using small and low-yield weapons, but only against dedicated military targets. Attacks on military targets close to population or industrial centers were strictly forbidden, as it was hoped that attacking only military targets deployed in the field would limit the possibility for escalation. If US nuclear attacks did not hit civilian or industrial centers, then the Soviets may respond with tactical nuclear strikes of their own, but not initiate a full response targeting American civilian and industrial sectors. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only way to secure victory against the Soviet Union. Today, nuclear war planning takes a similar and flexible approach, seeking to limit the possibility of unchecked escalation. While the United States currently has the conventional military power to defeat Russia or China without the need of nuclear weapons, should that balance of power change, we can envision how the US would respond to a nuclear war. Today, the US maintains a very small inventory of tactical nuclear weapons, and these weapons can only be delivered via military aircraft, a far cry from systems such as the man-portable Davy Crockett tactical weapon, which could be fired by a group of 3 men at columns of Soviet tanks. In a fictional scenario where Russia or China achieved numerological and technological parity with the US, and war broke out, these low-yield tactical nuclear weapons would make up the first salvo of a nuclear war. With approximately 500 B-61 gravity bombs, the United States would quickly begin arming F-16s and F-35s with these variable-yield weapons. Initially, they would be launched against enemy positions, hitting large concentrations of troops and, much like in the Cold War, avoiding striking at civilian or industrial centers. One major problem with the Cold War-era planning was that despite Soviet military targets being the initial focus in a nuclear exchange, launching an attack against these targets without complete and total surprise would take so long that most of the equipment and personnel at these sites would have been evacuated. Some mission-critical hardware and structures that could not be physically moved would be destroyed, and the site rendered inoperable for several weeks, but most of the actual military targets the US was looking to destroy would avoid the attack by simply dispersing. Today, dispersion is less of a concern thanks to greatly improved surveillance and attack capabilities that the Cold War US could only have dreamt of. Advanced reconnaissance satellites can easily pinpoint the movement of enemy troops and hardware, and global communications afforded by satellite links can easily connect pilots on strike missions with the intelligence needed to hit the right targets. Thus, in a modern scenario, American F-16s and F-35s would immediately be launched in attacks against enemy troop formations. It would be expected that the enemy would retaliate in kind, and it's even hoped so. After all, if enemy forces retaliated with similar tactical nuclear strikes, they might feel satisfied and not need to escalate an exchange. To limit their own losses, American units would widely disperse, while other US assets sought to interfere with or destroy the complex communications and intelligence chains of assets required for accurate targeting. The next level of nuclear escalation would come if the US believed that a greater expansion was inevitable, or if enemy forces began the escalation themselves. The United States would next move to attack more strategic rather than tactical targets, striking out enemy military installations and communications hubs. These attacks may still be carried out with airborne assets, but other than the B-2 stealth bomber, it's not likely any American aircraft would survive long enough to deliver the bombs to assigned targets deeper in enemy-held territory. Instead, the United States would need to either use submarine-launched ballistic missiles or SLBMs or traditional ICBMs. Modern American weapons feature the ability to produce variable yields, scaling up or down their destructive potential. Future American nuclear weapons will even be able to scale their yields down as low as 2% of the bomb used on Hiroshima. This gives the US options that would hopefully limit the expansion of a nuclear war. By using low-yield weapons against non-civilian or industrial targets, it's hoped that if any response was forthcoming, then that response would similarly target American military and communication targets with low-yield weapons and avoid industry and population centers. One certain target would be Russian or Chinese nuclear weapons, and this presents a problem for US war planners. It's not believed that the SLBMs have the penetration power to permanently shut down any ICBM field, requiring the use of ICBMs for the job. American ICBMs, however, would themselves be immediately targeted by enemy ICBMs unless the American attack was a bolt out of the blue, which achieved complete surprise. With submarine-based weapons lacking the penetration power of ICBMs, and American ICBM fields in the US being immediately counterattacked by enemy nuclear strikes, this means that the US faces a conundrum. While it wishes to limit the scope of the war, not using all of its available ICBM inventory at the start of a war means it will never get a chance to do so, as any unlaunched ICBMs will be destroyed by enemy counterattacks. It is the traditional use-it-or-lose-it scenario, and one that many fear means a limited escalation is all but impossible. If the US chose to use ICBMs only to strike at military targets and enemy missile fields, and left those targeting major population and industrial centers for deterrence unlaunched, then they would be destroyed in the ensuing counterattack, and the US would forever lose the ability to launch its most high-yield weapons. In this scenario, the United States would have given up nuclear parity and deterrence from escalation by holding cities under threat for the sake of striking a few military targets, losing nearly half of all of its nuclear capabilities, while using only a small fraction of them in return. Should any enemy nuclear missile fields remain operational after the attack, the US would be at a severe disadvantage going forward. It's likely then that striking at only military targets is impossible, and the US would simply opt for escalating one more rung up the ladder. This would involve adding enemy industrial and economic hubs to the list of approved targets for nuclear strike, with the aim of preventing attacks against population centers, but still destroying the enemy's ability to continue fighting. At this point in a nuclear war, targeting would have the dual purpose of not just stopping the enemy's ability to fight today, but ensuring that the enemy is far too damaged economically or politically to rebuild faster than the United States in the post-war period. For US nuclear war planning, considerations on the US achieving superiority in the post-war period are given highest priority. The next step in the nuclear war ladder is an all-out exchange, with the targeting of major population centers. This is in fact not an active war plan of the United States, meaning that a massive attack against enemy cities is not actually planned for as part of any war planning. Rather, a massive all-out exchange would be the casualty of an increasingly escalating nuclear war. The ability to target and destroy cities is held only as a deterrent, hopefully convincing the enemy that escalating past the previous rung on the nuclear ladder is simply not worth it. If, however, an initial attack was detected or even just feared, the US may simply opt to attack first. As part of its commitment to safeguard allies under its nuclear umbrella, the United States retains a nuclear first strike policy to this day. As nuclear war escalates, a select portion of the American military and nuclear assets would immediately go into reserve in sheltered locations. US war planning dictates that a strategic reserve of both nuclear weapons and conventional forces be established during a nuclear conflict, so that in the post-war period the United States still has access to some level of conventional military power as well as nuclear weapons for defense. Even in a post-nuclear war involving an all-out exchange and the destruction of most major cities around the world, the same nuclear weapons that brought about the end of the world would remain ready to launch a new apocalyptic war for whoever survives.
A missile flies through the air at over 5 times the speed of sound. It swerves to avoid countermeasures that try to stop it. The target is within sight. The hypersonic missile adjusts its course one last time before altering its angle of descent and racing toward a high-priority military target. This is the fastest missile in the world, and nothing can stop it. Unfortunately for the United States military, hypersonic missile technology is one of the only things they haven't managed to master yet. Even worse news for the United States is that the 2 countries that are ahead of them in hypersonic missile development are Russia and China. As of right now, it seems unlikely that these countries would go to war with one another, but that could all change in an instant. Russia is constantly pushing its luck when it comes to invading neighbors and influencing foreign affairs around the world. China is becoming a superpower whose economy will likely outgrow the United States in the coming years, making them one of the dominant forces in the world. All of these things have raised tensions over the last decade that will not cool anytime soon. The United States, Russia, and China all want to have power and the ability to spread their influence across the globe. Hypersonic missiles are one type of technology many military strategists believe will allow them to do this. What are these futuristic weapons? Why are they important? And how has the United States fallen so far behind in the development of hypersonic missiles? Let's find out. There is a technical difference between supersonic and hypersonic weapons. Supersonic means that something travels faster than Mach 1, or the speed of sound. Hypersonic, on the other hand, means that an object is traveling faster than Mach 5, or 5 times the speed of sound. There are plenty of problems that aircraft and missiles encounter when traveling above the speed of sound, but as an object approaches hypersonic speeds, all sorts of inconvenient phenomena begin to occur. Mach 5 is about 3,836 miles per hour. This is incredibly fast for any man-made object. In fact, at these speeds, there are some huge obstacles that the missile object needs to overcome to prevent it from being ripped apart by friction and heat. Almost every spacecraft that's ever re-entered the atmosphere and landed safely traveled at hypersonic speeds. When NASA space shuttles were still in use, they would exceed Mach 25, or around 17,500 miles per hour during re-entry. Therefore, hypersonic crafts aren't new. It's the true hypersonic missiles and their maneuvering capabilities that the United States is struggling with right now. The goal for a hypersonic missile is not only to travel faster than Mach 5 without being torn apart, but also to be able to maneuver aerodynamically at these speeds. Hypersonic missiles must be able to dodge defenses and change course at a moment's notice. There are a few problems with overcoming the challenges associated with maneuverability at hypersonic speeds, all of which have seemed to plague the U.S. Department of Defense research teams for decades. One of the most challenging aspects of creating viable hypersonic missiles is that they need to be able to withstand a huge amount of heat while traveling and turning through the air. When making adjustments at Mach 5 and above, the missile's casing can be heated to over 2,000 degrees Celsius or 3,632 degrees Fahrenheit. Obviously, this can be a problem when carrying a powerful explosive. The missile must be able to shed the heat while maintaining its shape and structure. It also must be able to keep the combustible materials inside cool so that it doesn't explode when adjusting course. Maneuvering at hypersonic speeds doesn't just generate massive amounts of heat around the hull of the missile, it also causes turbulence. As a hypersonic missile exceeds Mach 5, it experiences a buildup of air pressure in front of it. When the missile passes through the air, the built-up pressure at the front of the missile collapses into the space behind it, and it creates a sonic boom. The compression of air and the buildup of pressure causes a massive amount of turbulence. The aerodynamic shape of the missile helps the airflow around it, but there is no getting around the jostling that comes with hypersonic flight. This means that the missile needs to be able to withstand a beating before reaching its target. All of the shaking can cause components to come loose and systems to malfunction. This is a huge problem when everything about a hypersonic missile needs to be incredibly precise. But there are even bigger issues that need to be addressed before a hypersonic missile can fly. In order for the engines aboard a hypersonic missile to work, there needs to be a way to ignite the fuel within the booster while it's traveling at hypersonic speeds. Aircraft that travel faster than sound but below Mach 5 use an engine called a ramjet that uses the compressed air at the front of the vessel to feed oxygen into its engine. However, once a missile or aircraft reaches hypersonic speeds, the air traveling through the engine moves so fast that the entire combustion process is thrown off. On larger craft such as the space shuttle, there are self-contained systems that generate power and thrust, allowing the engines to continue functioning even at hypersonic speeds. Unfortunately, hypersonic missiles are too small to contain their own power sources and therefore need to use what's called a scramjet engine to maintain speed and power. This is where the problems start to come in. Scramjet engines are still being developed in the United States. There are some that have already been tested successfully but never aboard a missile. The scramjet engines work similarly to the ramjets, except the air flowing through them needs to be slowed down so that the ignition timing is in sync with the airflow. If there's too much fuel or too little oxygen during the combustion process, the engine could stall, and the missile would fall from the sky. The problem is further exacerbated when the missile needs to turn or adjust course. Every movement will change the rate of airflow going into the engine, which will then need to be taken into account in order to keep the combustion happening at the right intervals. Yet, even though these challenges make hypersonic missile technology incredibly difficult to achieve, it has been done. Both China and Russia have operational hypersonic missiles. Now, it's important to keep in mind that operational doesn't necessarily mean they're mass-producing these weapons, or that they can even get them to work all the time. It means that they've successfully tested hypersonic missiles and are able to replicate the process. However, most military experts outside of these countries are suspicious of how accurate the hypersonic missiles developed in China and Russia actually are. Creating a missile that can fly at hypersonic speeds is one thing, but using a missile to hit a precise target is totally a different story. Therefore, the hypersonic missiles currently developed probably are not the most effective. But the fact remains that China and Russia are still further along in the hypersonic missile race than the United States. If nothing else, the flight of hypersonic missiles by China and Russia has forced the US and its allies to invest more time, money, and manpower into creating operational hypersonic missiles in order to move to the next phase of warfare. There are currently two different types of hypersonic missile delivery systems being used. The first is the hypersonic glide vehicle, which consists of a large ballistic missile that contains a hypersonic missile inside of it. Once the ballistic missile reaches upper atmosphere, it releases the glide vehicle. As the glide vehicle plummets toward the surface of the Earth, it engages its engines and accelerates to hypersonic speeds. The hypersonic glide vehicles use a mixture of the planet's gravity and its engines to reach speeds over Mach 5 as they close in on the target. The problem is that in order to get these missiles to the right altitude for deployment, they have to first be carried into the sky by a much larger rocket that's traveling at slower speeds. This makes the delivery rocket with a hypersonic missile inside of it more vulnerable to being shot down during the launch process. The second type of hypersonic missile that's been developed is the hypersonic cruise missile. These are what every military around the world is working on perfecting. Hypersonic cruise missiles employ scramjet technology that allows them to travel at hypersonic speeds all on their own. They can be launched from an aircraft already moving at supersonic speeds and then accelerate beyond Mach 5 as they travel to their target. Once fired from the delivery vehicle, the hypersonic cruise missile will use state-of-the-art navigation systems to avoid enemy defenses and destroy its target. So, the question is, what type of hypersonic missiles do the Chinese and Russians have, and how far behind them is the US? On December 26, 2018, Russia launched its newest ballistic missile, the RS-28 Sarmat, from a base in the Ural Mountains. On board the ballistic missile was a hypersonic glide vehicle called an Avangard. The ballistic missile carried Avangard into the stratosphere and deployed it. The Avangard accelerated back toward the Earth and carried out a number of zigzagging patterns for over 3,700 miles above Siberia at Mach 27. It then crashed in the Kamchatka Peninsula. This was all information that the Russian military provided, so it needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Upon completion of the test, Russian President Vladimir Putin reportedly called Avangard the perfect New Year's gift for the country. Even scarier than Putin's remarks is the fact that after the test, the Russian Defense Ministry informed the world that they now had put a nuclear warhead on the Avangard and that they were the first country to be armed with not only hypersonic weapons, but hypersonic nukes. Russia also has a second hypersonic missile called the Kinzhal. This is closer in design to a hypersonic cruise missile, although it is slightly different. It does not use a scramjet engine to maintain its speed, but instead uses a conventional rocket engine that's designed to withstand enormous pressures and turbulence. The Kinzhal is claimed to be able to reach Mach 12 using this brute force technique, but this has not been confirmed. What we do know about this missile is that it seems to be a modified 9K-720 Iskander. The 9K-720 Iskander is hardly a short-range ballistic missile. The Russians have claimed to put a sophisticated guidance system on board that allows the Kinzhal to still hit its target even while traveling at hypersonic speeds. The main problem with the Kinzhal is that it's more like a drag racer than a sleek aerodynamic missile. It can achieve hypersonic speeds while also maintaining its hull integrity, but only when flying in a straight line. It's claimed to be able to maneuver while on its flight path, but there is no evidence to support that the Kinzhal is able to change direction drastically once it passes Mach 5. China has created a hypersonic glide missile similar to the Avangard called the DFZF. It's deployed from a DF-17 rocket, which is what carries the hypersonic glide vehicle into the upper atmosphere before deploying it. Once deployed, the DFZF can reach hypersonic speeds, but it's estimated that it tops out somewhere between Mach 5 and Mach 10. The DFZF was designed as an anti-naval ship weapon, which has put the United States on edge, as one of the most powerful weapons in the Pacific is its aircraft carriers. Like with Russia's missiles, it's still unclear if the DFZF has an operational guidance system that makes it accurate, or if it's just a very fast weapon that may or may not land somewhere close to its target. Even though both Russia and China have designed and seem to have successfully launched hypersonic missiles, it's unlikely that they found a way to make them accurate enough to hit an actual target. This brings us back to the United States and why they seem so far behind on the race to create operational hypersonic missiles. When we look at the Department of Defense's track record with hypersonic missiles, it is not good. In fact, over the past decade, there have been many more failures than successes. The frustrating part for the engineers and researchers working on these projects is that they constantly run into roadblocks and preventable catastrophes. If they were given the resources and funds they needed for the project, the United States would likely already have basic hypersonic missiles. The craziest part about many of the failed tests is that they were caused by faulty boosters and separation mechanisms. In these cases, the missiles were destroyed before reaching hypersonic speeds, so a ton of data was either lost or never collected. In fact, documents that have been released indicate that out of the 16 hypersonic missile tests carried out since 2010, a quarter of them failed as a result of the conventional rocket booster malfunctioning. Another 2 tests failed because of separation problems, and a final test failed due to undisclosed reasons, meaning that almost 50% of the tests ended before the missile could reach hypersonic speed. That being said, the United States has had a successful test in recent years, which means the US has finally entered the hypersonic missile theater. However, it was several years later than both China and Russia. At this point, the United States is still pretty far behind both countries when it comes to hypersonic technology. We don't truly know how many failures both China and Russia had before successfully launching and flying their hypersonic missiles due to a lack of transparency from their governments and tight control of media outlets. One of the main reasons the US is so far behind these other countries is because military leaders didn't feel that there was a pressing need to develop hypersonic missile technology. By the time they figured out that Russia and China were already on the cutting edge of this technology, the US had only run a handful of tests, none of which were successful, and didn't have the infrastructure to ramp up research and production. Bureaucracy has definitely played a role in the lack of funding and seriousness around the United States' hypersonic missile projects. Without a sense of urgency around the development of these missiles, progress was slow. And now the United States is regretting its previous decisions when it comes to these weapons. In the last several years, the Air Force has been submitting investment portfolios and plans to build better test ranges to develop hypersonic missile technology. But due to budget constraints, many of these necessities have been turned down. This is incredibly frustrating for the research and development teams who know how vital these missiles will be in the future. Even more important than the test ranges themselves is the need for underground tunnels where the missiles can be safely tested. As far as we know, there's only one underground tunnel in the United States that can withstand both the speed and temperatures associated with testing hypersonic missile technology. The caveat is that this tunnel does not belong to the Air Force. Instead, it belongs to NASA. Unsurprisingly, NASA has its own technology and missions to focus on, so finding time to use the testing tunnel can be extremely difficult. But it's not just a lack of funding and resources that stalled hypersonic missile research for the US, it also has to do with timing. In the 1990s, it looked as if the United States would be the first country to master hypersonic technology. They were light years ahead of any other competitor and had a plethora of aircraft designs that looked promising. Not to mention the space shuttle had been in operation for over a decade. Then, conflict broke out. The Gulf War, followed by instability in the Middle East, led the U.S. to dedicate more time, money, and resources to existing technology that had already proven itself in combat, rather than developing new tech. Vehicles like the F-14 Tomcat and the F-22 Raptor were produced in high numbers while hypersonic missile technology was put on the back burner. Now that tensions are once again beginning to flare up with Russia, and a new threat to American influence abroad is presented by a growing Chinese economy and military, the United States government has started throwing money at advanced weapons research. However, it might be a little too late. In 2020, the Pentagon allocated just over $2 billion for developing hypersonic tech. Then in 2021, this number was raised to $3.2 billion. In the year 2022, as this video is being made, the US government is devoting $3.8 billion to the future development of hypersonic technology. To be fair, there are around 70 hypersonic programs that the government is funding, and not all have to do with hypersonic missiles, but at least 7 that we know of do, which would be more hypersonic missiles than the United States currently has. The United States also has another advantage when it comes to developing hypersonic technology. Unlike Russia and China, the US has an entire private sector to pull resources and technology from. Companies like SpaceX, Boeing, and Blue Origin are all working on their own hypersonic technology as they develop their space tourism vessels. The United States government can contract out these companies or piggyback on their ideas and tech. There's also another large difference between what the United States sees its hypersonic missiles becoming compared to the other two nations. It seems that hypersonic missiles both Russia and China have developed are mainly created to deliver nuclear payloads to a target. This is true, then those missiles only need to be relatively accurate. As they strike anywhere near their target, the nuclear payload will do the rest of the work. The United States is currently focusing its efforts on creating hypersonic missiles that can be precise and deliver a non-nuclear warhead. This means what the US is trying to do with its hypersonic missile program is much more complex than the missiles that have been developed in Russia and China. If a nuke is fired, it doesn't really matter if it's delivered on a hypersonic missile or a ballistic missile, the result will be the same. Nuclear war between world powers will break out and the planet will be destroyed by nuclear winter. At that point, hypersonic technology will be a moot point. But if the United States can develop hypersonic missile technology that is accurate, while also delivering a conventional explosive, the missile would be an excellent deterrent and an unstoppable weapon in battle. At this point, all three countries have plans to expand their hypersonic missile technology. Russia's working on their 3M-22 Zircon hypersonic anti-ship missile, which will need to be much more maneuverable and accurate than anything they've created thus far. China, on the other hand, is working toward completing their DF-41 program, which will be a hypersonic fragmentation orbital bombardment system. The United States is still technically behind in the hypersonic missile game, but they're closing the gap fast. It's only a matter of time until the US develops a working hypersonic missile. The question is, did they give their adversaries too much of a head start? 1982, the Moon. A small force of armored troop transports crawl along the lunar surface. The vehicles are limited to only 24 miles an hour at maximum. Any faster and the next bump could send the vehicle and its crew flying hundreds of feet in the reduced gravity. The lumbering APCs clear a crater and suddenly come into view of their objective, a Soviet lunar outpost on the dark side of the Moon. Immediately upon clearing the crater's rim, the APCs come under fire from Soviet laser cannons, but the American vehicles are coated in a highly reflective outer shell that reflects much of the incoming laser energy. The powerful defensive lasers eventually burn through the protective shell, but it's been built in layers, granting each vehicle a few minutes protection from the withering laser energy. The vehicles launch several dozen canisters into the air above the Soviet base. Laser fire incinerates many of the canisters, but 12 survive. Lofted in a high trajectory over the base, an explosive charge propels a shower of razor-sharp spikes down onto the moon base as the canister is knocked out into orbit by the force of the explosion. The rain of deadly missiles does nothing to penetrate the Soviet base itself, buried under a few feet of lunar soil. But for the Soviet troops and laser batteries caught out in the open, the attack is deadly. The small projectiles tear through the equipment and rip open men's suits, exposing them to the freezing vacuum of space. As the vehicles near the lunar outpost, though, it's time for payback. The first vehicle to hit a landmine disappears in a massive plume of dust. A second and then a third quickly follow. These aren't ordinary landmines, though. Here on the moon, high explosives are extremely rare. In the reduced lunar gravity, even a moderately sized explosion could send lethal debris into orbit, or raining down dozens of miles away, killing and destroying friendly forces and installations. Instead of a conventional explosive, these landmines are really nothing more than tiny rocket mortars. Attached to a stabilizing plate, the mines are triggered as a vehicle rolls over it, which activates the rocket mortar, which in turn drives the plate into the vehicle from below. With a sixth of the gravity of Earth, the small rocket mortar at the bottom of the plate has more than enough force to send an armored vehicle hundreds of feet upward. Since the mines rarely hit center mass, the vehicles are sent in wild parabolic trajectories that are inevitably lethal to the crews inside. One American APC takes a Soviet mine in the front half of its body, sending it 300 feet upwards in a trajectory that will see it smash into a crater wall at dozens of meters a second, over 3 miles away. Only half of the APCs make it through the minefield and laser fire, and the troops inside quickly disembark. Instead of traditional EVA suits, though, these men are wearing special spacesuits that are still technically in the prototype phase. Traditional EVA suits are filled with breathable gases and pressurized to something close to Earth normal, making each individual look like a miniature Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. This severely limits individual mobility and is a massive liability, as soldiers are vulnerable to punctures and tears that would depressurize their suits and compromise their air supply. Perhaps as frightening as losing one's air supply, though, is what would happen to the body in an unpressurized environment. As the pressure of the gases inside the body exceed exterior pressure, the body would begin to swell and expand, causing severe pain and possibly rupturing organs. Water inside the body would soon begin to boil, causing further disastrous consequences. To aid in mobility and prevent the dangers of decompression, each soldier is equipped with a skin-tight suit that maintains a healthy pressure environment for the body via mechanical pressure. The suits are custom-made for each individual, as a tiny deviation in manufacture would mean disastrous consequences for that soldier and take a long time to don and doff. but offer incredibly increased mobility and survivability over normal pressurized suits. They also allow the wearing of additional armor plating without too adversely affecting a soldier's mobility, while traditional blow-up suits are simply too rigid already to bother with adding much armor. The much lower gravity of the moon also helps maintain mobility even with 24 pounds of ceramic armor plates over most of the body. Today's US space soldier looks more like a futuristic knight than a modern infantryman. The vulnerable air supply is worn as a backpack, and it, along with the hoses connecting to the helmet, are armored slightly more than the rest of the suit. But all this armor isn't to protect from bullets, as the Americans quickly find out from surviving Soviet defenders. Each Soviet is equipped with one of two variations of space guns. The first looks like a typical submachine gun from back here on Earth, but is anything but. Firstly, it doesn't use nearly as much gunpowder as a gun on Earth would. With a sixth the gravity, that much recoil would send a soldier flying backward with their first trigger pull. Instead, each bullet has less than a tenth of the gunpowder of a normal bullet, and yet despite this still reaches velocities upwards of 3,000 to 4,000 feet per second, as much as 1,000 feet per second faster than a .762 round here on Earth. But that much powder comes with a price, and automatic fire is impossible in such low gravity. Instead, the firing soldier must carefully line up each individual shot before firing, taking the time to re-steady themselves before each shot. The gun is best for long-range engagements, and the Americans are rapidly closing the distance with their nimble combat suits. At closer range, the Soviets switch to a different weapon. This one also has a long barrel, but the magazines are actually attached directly to the sides of the barrel itself. The dual magazines need to be physically manipulated to push a long, razor-sharp dart into the chamber. Then a gas cartridge inserted into the butt of the weapon is activated with a firing trigger, causing it to propel the dart out of the weapon at several hundred feet a second. The weapon resembles a more modern version of a crossbow than a Buck Rogers space gun, but is deadly effective in the low-gravity and zero-atmosphere environment of the moon, giving it incredible range and accuracy. Unlike on Earth, in space there's no atmospheric friction or other effects to act on a projectile, so space guns are incredibly accurate. The only thing limiting the accuracy of each weapon is the difficulty in taking a proper firing stance when bracing against the recoil and bringing the weapon's sights up to a shooter's eyes through the bulky spacesuit. But the Americans have their own answer to the lack of accuracy, and it's not just their much sleeker ergonomic spacesuits. As an American soldier vaults into a Soviet trench in the lunar gravity, he flips forward a strange tube mounted on his shoulder and presses a lever on the side. The shoulder-mounted weapon is, like most other space weapons, made out of plastic and various composites, as regular metal or wood would be impossible to operate on the moon. For starters, the extreme temperatures ranging from 260 degrees Fahrenheit to negative 280 degrees wreak havoc on normal weapon materials, and the intense heating could cause ammunition to simply explode. Even if a metal weapon survived the extreme temperatures, the metal components would inevitably fuse together in the vacuum of space. This is known as cold welding, and happens when two similar metals are brought into contact with each other and their molecules mix together. Here on Earth, a layer of oxidization prevents it from happening, but in space that layer eventually wears off. If these weren't enough challenges for a gunsmith to overcome, there's also the fact that lubricants in space tend to evaporate in the absence of an atmosphere. That means the American shoulder-mounted weapon, just like any other space weapon, is made up of plastic and other composites and operates via recoil rather than gas like on Earth. But this weapon is slightly different from the others the Soviets have faced so far. As soon as the American Astro soldier presses the firing mechanism on the side of the strange cylinder, a tiny charge of gas expels 3 dozen darts about an inch long. The darts are expelled at a modest 6 meters a second, but upon firing, a charge at the rear of each dart is ignited. Exactly half a second later, with the darts now 3 meters away from the shooter, each charge explodes, propelling the darts forward with terrible velocity. The weapon is the equivalent of a space shotgun and is meant to shower a small area with high-speed flechettes. To avoid sending the firing soldier flying backwards and possibly into lunar orbit from the explosive recoil, each round is designed to be accelerated out of the barrel of the gun with a small gas charge, while the actual propellant charge is ignited and calculated to burn for half a second before exploding well clear of the shooter. The gun isn't very accurate, but it doesn't need to be. The lethal shower of flechettes means instant death out to a range of 100 or more meters, one reason why the weapon cannot be fired with any friendlies in the line of sight. Now that the fighting is in the lunar trenches, though, the Soviets bring out their own close-quarters weapons. A Soviet soldier lifts up his personal sidearm to defend himself, and the weapon looks almost ridiculously dainty and fragile. The weapon has a long, very thin barrel, slightly longer than a revolver, and a top-mounted magazine. The magazine feeds the weapon with a dozen razor-sharp darts, just over 2 inches long, and these are propelled by a gas canister housed within the grip of the strange pistol itself. The gas-operated weapon suffers from the same recoil issues as any space gun, but its smaller size means the Soviet soldiers able to reacquire his target much faster. Even with just a modest blast of gas, the lack of atmospheric friction and low gravity means that each dart is still sped up to velocities similar to those of normal bullets back on Earth. Some of the weapons don't even use gas at all, but are operated by a spring which is cocked manually before each firing. Instead of darts, they fire ceramic pellets and reach the same speed and lethality as a .22 back here on Earth. In space, though, the best close-quarters weapon is the same as it's been back on Earth for 1,000 years. And as the fighting drags on, the fancy space guns are quickly discarded after running out of darts, pellets, or flechettes, or gas. Now the fighting is done hand-to-hand with razor-sharp knives made out of tough ceramic. But here on the moon, even a tiny cut can be immediately lethal. The American suits with their mechanical pressure are better able to handle punctures and tears, but first aid in a space environment is practically non-existent. If a wounded individual doesn't have their wound immediately and thoroughly sealed, it doesn't matter if the rest of their suit maintains integrity. The vacuum of space will draw out all liquids it can through the wound very rapidly, turning even a minor stab into a critical injury. At last, the fighting draws to a close. The American troops stand victorious. They've lost over half their numbers, but they have succeeded in eliminating the Soviet position and securing the lunar outpost. Any remaining troops left inside the outpost's buildings will either surrender or simply be left to asphyxiate as the outer shell of each building is purposefully breached and the atmosphere vented. But victory is short-lived, and suddenly on the horizon is the telltale plume of decelerating spacecraft. The Americans quickly rush to take up their own defensive positions. Soviet reinforcements are on the way. Thanks to low gravity, it's easy and fast to move troops around via pod-like craft that detach from an orbiting ship's main body. And with a low enough orbit, a ship can orbit the moon every 2.5 hours. That time frame can be shrunk even further for faster orbits and thus faster response. But it comes at the risk of flying at a lower, faster orbit and being more vulnerable to ground fire. Orbital mechanics are very much in the minds of the surviving American troops as they watch the deceleration plumes of the incoming drop pods, as calculating altitude and speed will not just let them know how long until they're once more under fire, but exactly where each drop pod will land. Maybe, just maybe, if they manage to ambush one or two of the incoming pods, they may have a chance of seeing home again and breathing in real air once more. How many nuclear weapons does the U.S. actually have? As of this year, estimates put the U.S. nuclear stockpile at around 5,500 total, with around 3,700 active nuclear warheads. 1,744 are currently deployed, 1,344 on ballistic missiles, 300 at various strategic bomber sites around the country, and a further 100 at air bases around Europe. Another 1,950 active warheads are stockpiled in silos as a sort of hedge in case of potential or military catastrophes. The United States thus possesses the second largest nuclear arsenal on Earth, falling slightly behind Russia's numbers. Together, these two countries make up roughly 90% of the estimated 12,700 nuclear weapons around the globe today. Yet, this is still a far lower total than in past decades. At the height of the Cold War, the U.S. alone maintained more than 10,000 active nuclear warheads as a deterrent against the Soviet Union. So, how and why did America build this massive arsenal of world-ending weapons? History of U.S. nuclear weapons. As the first country to develop nuclear weapons and the only one to use them in combat, the U.S. has played a significant role in the history of weapons of mass destruction. But this story of their development actually began in Berlin, Germany in 1938. There, scientists discovered nuclear fission, a reaction in which the nucleus of an atom is split, creating multiple lighter elements and releasing an incredible amount of energy. It's the energy released by fission that powers atomic weapons. These findings were confirmed by the splitting of a uranium atom in January of 1939. And even before the results were published, news had traveled across the Atlantic, making the U.S. government nervous about the Nazis' scientific capabilities. These fears escalated after the outbreak of World War II in Europe. In September 1939, physicist Albert Einstein, concerned that the Nazis would develop nuclear weapons before the Allies, wrote a letter to U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, urging the U.S. to stockpile uranium and begin work on its own nuclear weapons project. Despite Einstein's urging, progress was slow for several years. But on December 28, 1942, Roosevelt formally authorized the Manhattan Project, a top-secret effort bringing scientists and military officials together to develop atomic weapons. Most of the Manhattan Project's work took place in Los Alamos, New Mexico, under the direction of theoretical physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, today known as the father of the atomic bomb. After several years of intensive work, the project was successful. On July 16, 1945, on a remote patch of desert near Alamogordo, New Mexico, the first ever nuclear weapon was detonated, codenamed the Trinity Test. This event ushered in the world's first atomic age. The scientists of the Manhattan Project created two varieties of the nuclear bomb, a uranium-based bomb known as Little Boy and a plutonium-based model named Fat Man. While World War II in Europe had ended with Nazi Germany surrendering in May 1945, fighting continued between US and Japanese forces in the Pacific. In July, President Harry Truman released the Potsdam Declaration, promising prompt and utter destruction for Japan if it did not surrender. Then, on August 6, 1945, the US dropped its little boy bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima, exploding with 13 kilotons of force, equivalent to 13,000 tons of TNT. The bomb vaporized the 5 square miles around where it was detonated, killing over 80,000 people instantly. In the following weeks, thousands of Japanese citizens would die from radiation exposure. 3 days later, the second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, killing over 40,000 on impact and again leveling much of the city. On August 15th, Japan's Emperor Hirohito announced the country's unconditional surrender, citing the power of a new and most cruel bomb. For a short time after World War II, the US remained the world's only nuclear power, but several years later, the Soviet Union was able to steal plans for a fission bomb, and on August 29, 1949, tested their first successful nuclear weapon. In response, the US began a program to develop advanced thermonuclear weapons, which use both fission and fusion to create an explosion hundreds or thousands of times more powerful than first-generation atomic bombs. This marked the beginning of the Cold War arms race, during which the US and Soviet Union would stockpile tens of thousands of these weapons, first as conventional bombs and later mounted on intercontinental ballistic missiles or ICBMs. These huge arsenals were seen as a deterrent against one another under the doctrine of so-called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Despite the threat of mutual annihilation under MAD, the Cold War almost led to the use of nuclear weapons several times. The most famous of these was the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. The U.S., under the rule of President John F. Kennedy, discovered that the USSR had positioned nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade around Cuba, leading to a 13-day standoff where the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. The crisis ended when Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in return for the U.S. promising not to invade Cuba and secretly removing some of its own nuclear weapons from Eastern Europe. Following the crisis and the emergence of a strong anti-nuclear movement, the U.S. and USSR signed the first non-proliferation treaty in 1968, separating the world into nuclear and non-nuclear states. Nuclear states, including the US, Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and China, agreed to not use or spread nuclear technology, while also reducing their own stockpiles, while non-nuclear states agreed not to develop their own nuclear weapons. While Cold War tensions rose once again in the 70s and 80s, fears of nuclear war finally declined with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. During the early 21st century, fears of nuclear war remained relatively low, and both the US and Russia continued to reduce their stockpiles. But in recent years, the tension between Russia and the US over Ukraine has led to renewed fears of a nuclear standoff, or worse. Today, the US nuclear arsenal is still structured much as it was during the Cold War, split between a nuclear triad of land, air, and sea-based weapons, which give the country first and second strike capability anywhere on the planet. Land-based triad leg. The land-based portion of the U.S. nuclear triad is primarily made up of 400 LGM-30G Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles. First developed in the late 1950s, the Minuteman weapon system was revolutionary. By using solid rocket fuel, the missiles were ready to launch at any time, meaning the U.S. could respond to a nuclear attack on short notice. The current Minuteman III missiles are just under 60 feet in length and weigh about 75,000 pounds each. They have a range of roughly 6,200 miles, a ceiling of 700 vertical miles, and a top speed of Mach 23, more than 15,000 miles per hour. In 1970, upgrades to the Minuteman systems made them the first ICBMs to use multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, MIRVs, a type of payload containing multiple nuclear warheads designed to hit separate targets. The missiles are stored in fortified silos, connected to a subterranean launch control center through a system of hardened cables. From the launch control center, two-man launch crews perform around-the-clock drills to prepare for the possibility of a nuclear attack. Advanced communication systems provide instant contact between the president and the launch crews. And in the event of communication loss, specially configured E-6B Airborne Launch Control Center aircraft are designed to take control of the missiles to carry out a strike. According to the Department of Defense, the current Minuteman III ICBMs are split between the 90th Missile Wing at F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming, the 341st Missile Wing at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, and the 91st Missile Wing at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. Air-based triad leg. The air-based leg of the nuclear triad is divided between two types of nuclear-capable bombers, with 46 aircraft in total. First is the B-52H Stratofortress, an ultra-long-range heavy bomber capable of performing a variety of missions. First developed in the 50s and 60s, the Stratofortress has an incredibly powerful sensor array for precision targeting, has a range of more than 8,800 miles, and is capable of aerial refueling, allowing it to fly almost indefinitely. During maritime operations, two B-52s can monitor over 140,000 square miles of the ocean in 2 hours. Each bomber is able to carry nuclear weapons, up to 70,000 pounds of ordnance including gravity bombs, cluster bombs, precision-guided missiles, and joint direct attack munitions. The second bomber in the air-based triad is the B-2A Spirit, an ultra-high-altitude stealth bomber which can penetrate enemy air defenses. Developed in the late 1980s and utilized in Serbia, Afghanistan, and other conflicts, the Spirit's key advantage is its low observability, or stealth technology, which according to the DoD is derived from a combination of reduced infrared, acoustic, electromagnetic, and visual and radar signatures. This makes it extremely difficult for air defense systems to detect and engage a Spirit, allowing it to easily drop its 40,000 pounds of payload. The system is able to carry nuclear warheads and they have a range of 6,000 miles. As such, they can strike targets anywhere on Earth. Sea-based triad leg. Finally, the sea-based portion of the U.S. nuclear triad consists of 14 Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs, often known as boomers. These submarines serve as an undetectable launch platform for the missiles and are designed specifically for the delivery of nuclear warheads. Ohio-class subs are longer than 2 football fields and weigh over 18,000 tons apiece. Every Ohio SSBN can carry up to 20 submarine-launched Trident II ballistic missiles with a striking range of 4,000 miles, each containing up to 12 MIRVs. When fired, a Trident II re-enters the atmosphere at Mach 24 speeds and splits apart into multiple payloads of over 100 kilotons. Effectively, a full salvo from an Ohio-class submarine can unleash 192 nuclear warheads in under a minute, enough to level 24 cities at once. Due to this enormous payload capacity, the sea-based leg of the nuclear triad actually contains about 70% of the active U.S. nuclear arsenal. The main advantage of an Ohio-class sub as a nuclear deterrent is that they are nearly undetectable and can stay submerged for more than 70 days at a time. This makes them both a first and second strike weapon, which cannot be destroyed in retaliation, giving the U.S. a strategic edge in any potential nuclear war. From the days of World War II through the Cold War and to the present day, the U.S. nuclear arsenal has remained a powerful deterrent against enemies, but also a dangerous one, as the chance of nuclear war casts a long shadow over human civilization. To maintain a robust strategic deterrence, the United States splits its nuclear delivery systems across 3 viable paths: nuclear-capable bombers, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and land-based missile silos. These 3 deterrents make up the U.S. nuclear triad, a concept we'll explain soon. The United States began to build nuclear missile silos in 1959 when the technology for intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, began to become available. These silos, which now house the Minuteman III ICBM, complete with their 400 kiloton nuclear warheads, stretch from Montana to Missouri at their peak. After the end of the Cold War, many of these missile silos were decommissioned, but as of 2020, 400 Minuteman silos remain active in the Great Plains. There are also many more decommissioned sites from the earlier Peacekeeper, Titan, and Atlas ICBM programs, some of which are even available for private purchase if you can pony up the cash. Why did the Air Force, the branch of the armed forces that controls the ICBM program, decide to build the current Minuteman silos only in the Great Plains states? There were several good reasons for the site selection. Well, the Great Plains had the shortest launch trajectory to attack targets in the Soviet Union, as missiles there would have an easier time going over the North Pole and reaching their designated targets in the USSR's territory. The Great Plains are also far enough away from the coasts to give America enough time to launch a counteroffensive in case it came under attack from submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The places around these silos are also sparsely populated, meaning that enemy attacks on the ICBM silos would leave comparatively minimal collateral damage. Finally, being so deep into the interior of the U.S. naturally meant that these silos were and still are well beyond the reach of a conventional enemy attack. Their location was not the only means of defense the silos had. Minuteman and other ballistic missile silos were constructed as underground fortresses, parts of which stretch hundreds of feet deep. In fact, a couple of years ago, a rich businessman in Kansas bought a decommissioned silo that stretched 150 feet underground. He went on to turn it into a luxury survival condo. Being buried deep underground makes these silos harder to attack. Their depth serves as a formidable layer of security that many value in case of nuclear war. Getting into a nuclear missile silo One that's active anyway is far from easy. Ironically, nuclear silos are located on private lands, where the landowner has an incentive to prevent trespassing or other shenanigans. The silo's first line of defense is a fence. Beyond it is a radar security sensor that'll detect any object on the ground beyond the fence. If someone or something fishy is making waves, word will be sent to the numerous fully armed two-man security response teams who will investigate the disturbance. If you check out as an approved visitor, you'll need a security code to go through the personnel access hatch, which weighs over 2,000 pounds, so you're better off not trying to break through it. Afterward, you must travel through a 90-foot shaft that ends with a 14,000-pound barrier device known as the B-plug. Don't try to break through this one either, as nothing you have will work. Even if you brought a jackhammer or powerful explosives, only a second security code will allow one to pass this point, out of concern that those plugs would not allow fast enough access to thwart an internal attack. In the unlikely event that a group of terrorists were to infiltrate the silo, while the B-plug permits access, newer, faster operating ones were installed in the late 2000s, and now those are being further upgraded. Thanks to these new devices, which have their own unique energy sources by use of fast-spinning flywheel, nuclear silos are better protected against unconventional attacks. A silo's construction materials are another form of defense. They're built to withstand earthquakes and other natural or man-made disasters. Shock absorbers are built around sensitive electronic equipment. In their main makeup, nuclear missile silos are constructed from heavily reinforced concrete. The aforementioned silo in Kansas has concrete walls that are 9 feet thick. Some of the reinforced concrete in Minuteman silos are designed to withstand pressures of up to 2,000 psi. Although this sounds impressive, it's not enough to withstand a nearby nuclear blast, even if it's not a direct hit. And modern ICBM warheads are so accurate that they would almost certainly experience a direct hit if these silos were to become a target. This vulnerability is one of the reasons why some defense observers argue that the land-based ICBM program should be scrapped altogether, as unlike submarines and bombers, silos are stationary and sitting ducks in the event that the worst comes to happen. On the other hand, the silos are designed to be able to survive a nuclear attack by being spaced far enough away from one another as to make a complete decapitation of their capability unlikely. The surviving silos would then be able to launch a retaliatory nuclear strike. For example, the South Dakota Minuteman missile field at its peak in 1987 stretched across much of the western part of the state. It would take a sophisticated strike indeed to knock all of them out before at least some of them would be able to retaliate. The South Dakota field has since been decommissioned, but many such missile fields remain in service in states like North Dakota. The Air Force maintains such capabilities to enhance the mission of deterrence, which is as much psychological as physical. If an adversary knows that its first strike is likely to fail in removing America's ability to retaliate with its own nuclear weapons, an attempt at such a first strike becomes less probable. This is especially important fact to keep in mind as China builds 250 new ICBM-capable missile silos in 3 separate fields as part of their modernization of its nuclear forces in both quantity and quality, as fears of a new Cold War and nuclear arms race grow once again. The process for launching an ICBM is surprisingly simple, though naturally there are safeguards in place to ensure that there are no mistaken or corrupted launches. First, the president must decide that a nuclear launch is warranted. The decision may not be as simple as it seems, since in any such apocalyptic scenario, he may have as little as 7 minutes to be briefed and make the decision before enemy nuclear missiles may or may not impact the United States. There have been several close calls where things appearing on radar have seemed like incoming nuclear missiles but were not. For example, on March 15, 1980, a Soviet submarine operating near the Kuril Islands launched 4 missiles as part of a training exercise. An American early warning radar system suggested that one of the missiles was heading for the U.S., which forced a conclave of defense officials to hastily convene and assess if the threat was real. They concluded it was not, but this incident and others on both sides of the Iron Curtain showed how pressed for time leaders might be before being forced to make such a world-changing decision. With hypersonic missiles on the way, we could expect the situation to get even worse in the future. Should the president decide to authorize the launch, he'll inform the National Military Command Center, NMCC, at the Pentagon, which has a number of prepackaged nuclear response scenarios on standby. His identity must be verified, first through use of a unique code. If that code is valid, orders are sent to the launch crews, and all 400 of the Minuteman missiles currently in service could be in the air within minutes of receiving the presidential order. This scenario is called the Launch on Warning scenario, which leaves little room for error. The president also has the authority to authorize a nuclear first strike, largely under the same procedures. In either scenario, once the president makes his decision, it is final. As for the crew itself, there is a maze of fail-safes that they must navigate, in order to successfully launch their payload. In the earlier Titan II program, a series of electronic and mechanical waypoints needed to be passed in order to command the missile to launch. For example, there was a lock that required inputting a 6-digit code. There were only 7 chances to get the 17 million possible combinations correct. On the 8th attempt, the lock would commit electronic suicide, and there was no way to hack the codes either. If you were trying to guess it, you'd need to do it the old-fashioned way. To use the words of a director at the Titan II Silo Museum, the final step was for the crew commanders to turn separate keys simultaneously for 5 seconds. These keys needed to be held in their proper position, and it was impossible for one operator to turn both keys at the same time. Although the Titan II program is retired, similar safeguards are in place for the current Minuteman program. America's nuclear missile silos, even those operating in the year 2022, have what seem to be extremely primitive computing technology. You might be mistaken in thinking that it's still the 70s or the 1980s if you actually get a step inside an active silo. The Minuteman's operating system is called the Strategic Automated Command and Control System, or SACS. Missileers, as the personnel stationed in the silos are known, cannot simply Google their instructions or retrieve them through a database. They must instead do research the old-fashioned way by flipping through mounds of paper in giant black folders to find the right instructions. When computers are used, there are peculiarities you'll find nowhere else. For many years, the SAC system will still be retained not only on floppy disks, but the ancient 8-inch floppies. These have finally been retired, but the smaller ones that you might remember if you had the good fortune of experiencing the 80s and the 90s remain in service. As the Air Force is currently modernizing the ICBM program, these disks too are expected to go to the electronic graveyard, but the Air Force had a good reason for the retention of the ancient systems. The SAC system is ironically far safer from cyber attacks than the more modern software. The system is not connected to the internet, and since it has no IP address, it cannot be hacked. Unfortunately, this otherwise extremely attractive quality also means that maintenance on the system is harder, since modern military engineers are inadequate and the Air Force usually needs to call in civilian specialists who can, among other things, solder metal. Newer systems will be easier to maintain. Still, the silos won't change overnight, as the Air Force will undoubtedly want to ensure that robust safeguards are in place before replacing SACs. As the realm of cyber war grows more sophisticated, this means that this system will stay around for at least a few more years. So for now, we can all sleep safely, knowing that Russia, China, or Skynet won't be able to hack America's ICBMs. There was one eerie incident that could have triggered such a scenario, though. On October 23, 2010, Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming lost control of its 50 live Minuteman III missiles for nearly an hour. Had an unauthorized launch attempt come during that window, there would have been no way for the Air Force to stop it. The cause of the incident was later shown to be a faulty circuit card installed during routine maintenance of the SAC system. The incident is a reminder that despite the dangers of cyber warfare, there are still good reasons to modernize the ICBM program. Russia has acquired a new type of weapon that poses an existential threat to the United States. This was the cryptic warning given by U.S. Representative Mike Turner, the Republican head of the House Intelligence Committee. His warning was followed with an appeal for President Joe Biden to immediately declassify all available information on this threat so that the U.S., Congress, and American allies could work together to combat it. The news raced around the world like a firestorm and was quickly met with backlash from both Democrat and Republican lawmakers who condemned Turner's choice of publicly announcing this unnamed threat for needless fear-mongering. Since then, details have emerged on this Russian threat, and while Turner's information was accurate, the threat is significantly less dire than first portrayed. Since Turner's ill-fated tweet or zeet, the new details have emerged revealing that Russia's new weapon is an anti-satellite weapon. This is of significant concern given the U.S. military's overwhelming reliance on satellites for everything from communications to reconnaissance. America has the largest space network in the world, followed by China, and it's this vast constellation of satellites that makes the U.S. military a fast, agile, and highly responsive threat. America's satellites allow it to quickly share intelligence and coordinate the actions of different military units, both in the same theater and globally, as well as act as relay links for the nation's vast fleet of unmanned aerial, ground, and sea vehicles. But for all the advantages America's satellite superiority brings, it has been likened to the U.S. having constructed a, quote, exquisite glass house before the invention of the rock. America's satellite infrastructure is extremely vulnerable to rapidly modernizing near-peer opponents like China, who, along with Russia, already fields traditional anti-satellite weapons in the forms of missiles and lasers. While the Space Force is working to harden satellite infrastructure, these platforms are inherently vulnerable and difficult to protect from the range of threats they face, which can be as simple as just slowing them down enough so that they decay and fall out of orbit. Now Russia has upped the ante in the most Russian and ultimately dumb way possible. Traditional means of attacking satellites require pinpoint precision and only work on one satellite at a time. With over 8,000 satellites in orbit and the US's ability to piggyback off civilian satellites, if you truly wanted to cripple America's space-based network, you'd need to destroy way too many satellites at once. This is where Russia's weapon comes into play, and the threat it poses is significant enough that Representative Turner urged other members of Congress to come to a classified briefing to review all available intelligence on it. While details remain classified, it's strongly suspected that the weapon Russia is working on is meant to disable US satellites with a massive EMP, or electromagnetic pulse. EMPs can be generated with specialized equipment. The US, for example, has successfully tested a weapon that can be used as a missile and can launch pinpoint EMP attacks to shut down electronic equipment in specific areas, even targeting specific floors of a building. The electromagnetic threat is serious for modern economies and their militaries, given that every facet of our lives and military warfighting potential is defined by the widespread adoption of electronics. By frying circuits due to overloads of electromagnetic energy, EMP weapons can effectively destroy enemy equipment without having to physically attack it, with the fringe benefit of not causing any human casualties. It's unknown if Russia has the capability to build a device capable of generating a large enough EMP blast on its own to cover a wide area, or if the weapon in question is similar to the secretive US EMP weapon that can blast specific areas with electromagnetic radiation. What is known is that an EMP blast is easily produced by a weapon that Russia mastered long ago and is plentiful in its arsenal: the nuclear bomb. Upon detonation, a nuclear weapon releases a massive, if short-lived, pulse of electromagnetic energy that can cover an area as much as 1,000 square kilometers in orbit. This gives the Russian nuke a lot of real estate where it can destroy many American satellites all at once. While the skin of a standard communication satellite can withstand a significant amount of electromagnetic energy, antennas and apertures create openings through which EMP energy can penetrate into the interior. On the ground, many vehicles designed to operate on a nuclear battlefield are shielded from EMPs, but it's not known how possible it is to add that same amount of protection for satellites in orbit, or how cost-effective that would be. Every additional pound of payload needing to be placed in orbit equals thousands of dollars in launch costs and shortens the life of a satellite by consuming more fuel. It wouldn't take much for Russia to field an effective EMP weapon of this fashion, though US intelligence has affirmed that Russia has no such weapon operational at the moment. Despite social media's collective freakout about Russian nukes hanging over the world's head, there's no indication that this is the case, at least yet. Even so, all it would really take for Russia to suddenly field this capability is sticking a nuke on their rocket and sending it into high enough orbit, something easily accomplished given their space launch capabilities. The question is, would Russia actually do this? And 2 years ago, the answer would have been a confident no. However, recent events have proven that with Vladimir Putin, the sky is literally not the limit for his stupidity. Thanks to the UN's Treaty on Outer Space, no nation has ever placed weapons of mass destruction in orbit, despite an incredible incentive to do so. Even before satellites were a concern, placing nukes in space still provided a decisive strategic advantage, as it would cut the delivery time by more than half and significantly reduce the odds of interception. There would be no launch vehicle to intercept in the boost or pre-separation phase, and there would be little if any warning of a pending attack. With traditional ICBMs, Americans could enjoy anywhere from 15 minutes to a half hour of warning of a Soviet attack, depending on the launch complex and the target. With satellites hanging overhead, Americans would get mere minutes of warning to change into their costumes for a global Fallout LARP experience. By dramatically reducing warning and flight time, interception would also become significantly more difficult. This treaty held for decades, and even through the worst parts of the Cold War, but thanks to Putin it might go up in flames. But would Russia really do this, and how bad would it really be? In an effort to understand the effects and the uses of nuclear weapons, the United States performed a series of high-altitude tests as part of Operation Fishbowl. By 1958, it had already conducted 6 high-altitude tests, but a lack of proper instrumentation left U.S. scientists with more questions than answers. In 1962, the U.S. set about to conduct its largest high-altitude test yet, with a 1.4 to 1.45 megaton weapon set to go off 250 miles over the Earth. The resulting explosion ended up causing significantly more effects than first predicted. Aside from blowing the pants off every UFO in the vicinity, the explosion resulted in a brief second sun seen across the Pacific. The EMP blast, which had been predicted, turned out to be much larger than expected and was so overpowering that instruments used to document the explosion back down on Earth were overwhelmed. In Hawaii, almost 1,000 miles away from the detonation, 300 streetlights were burned out, burglar alarms were set off, and damage was caused to the electrical grid. A microwave link for the local telephone company was damaged enough to shut down all phone calls between the island of Kauai and the other islands. The blast damaged 9 satellites of the barely 3 dozen in orbit at the time, including Britain's first satellite ever. The explosion also created new belts of radiation around the Earth, while having an effect on the existing Van Allen radiation belt, which helps shield the Earth from charged particles hurled out by the Sun. The results were shocking to both the US and Soviet observers, who had significantly underestimated the power and the size of the EMP generated in space. Its effect on orbiting satellites was of serious concern, and it soon became clear that space-based nuclear weapons could pose a deadly risk to future military efforts. The Soviets would also conduct their own space-based tests, albeit at lower altitudes, resulting in damage to electronics on the ground and the power plant. An entirely new use for nuclear weapons had been confirmed, knocking out vast swaths of an enemy's modern electronic infrastructure. Since then, we've only become more vulnerable to space-based EMPs. Early vacuum tube technology was actually very resistant to the effects of EMPs, but semiconductors used today are extremely vulnerable. As an anti-satellite weapon, an EMP blast would be particularly effective for low Earth orbit satellites. At higher orbits that sit above the protection of the Earth's electromagnetic field, satellites need to be hardened against charged particles in space. However, at lower Earth orbits and snugly within the warm magnetic embrace of the Earth, manufacturers take advantage of this protection by not including hardening, which would end up adding weight and costs. It's not just electronically fried satellites that are the problem, though, as there is the obvious destruction caused by the blast itself. This would actually be significantly mitigated in space, as there is little medium to carry a shockwave. But the threat to nearby satellites could cause a runaway destruction event known as Kessler syndrome. This happens when enough space debris is generated that it in turn starts destroying other space assets, which only adds to the debris cloud. Eventually, there's so much space debris orbiting the Earth that it becomes impossible to predict all of its orbits, and thus spaceflight becomes too hazardous, and it could take anywhere from decades to centuries for space debris to deorbit on its own, leaving mankind trapped on this rock with Elon Musk. The question is then, is Russia dumb enough to actually do this? The immediate consideration is that putting any weapon of mass destruction into orbit would break the UN's Treaty on Outer Space. In retaliation, other nations who already field WMDs would put their own nukes in orbit as a deterrent to being attacked themselves. However, with the taboo broken, the non-WMD weaponization of space would truly begin and exponentially increase the risk of a Kessler syndrome event, all because Putin was sad about losing in Ukraine. And that is what this new anti-satellite weapon is all about. Predictable to the point of utter banality, every time Russia suffers a major setback in Ukraine or the West is on the verge of a new major arms shipment, Russia rolls out the old nuclear saber and starts rattling it. The strategy is effective at causing Westerners to shy away from supporting Ukraine and creating much historical hesitancy to provide arms in the 2 years since the wars began. With the US Congress close to a deal that would open up billions in funding for Ukraine, news of this test is likely yet another temper tantrum meant to deter the American public. There's also no reason to believe that Representative Mike Turner leaked this info on this threat on purpose. While he himself has been a strong proponent of Ukraine aid, Trump allies within the Republican Party, like Speaker and election denier Mike Johnson, have purposely sabotaged funding deals to create issues for the former president to run on. Turner, frustrated by the months of stalling on a funding deal, is believed to have released this intelligence to spur on action against Russia and get funding for Ukraine passed. But would Russia actually use this weapon? The thing about a massive EMP blast is that it's impossible to control. At a high enough altitude, ground effects could be prevented or seriously minimized. But Russia's space-based infrastructure would also be in jeopardy. Nuclear weapon-generated EMP blasts don't differentiate between American or Chinese satellites and the potatoes with duct tape cell phones that Russia probably has in space. Everything would be at risk of destruction. And it's the inclusion of foreign parties and vast amounts of civilian infrastructure that makes it all but a certainty that Russia would never use this weapon. China, who now has the second largest space network, would be furious over any uncontrolled anti-satellite weapon used in space, as would the rest of the world. Russia would become an even greater international pariah than before, losing any remaining partner that it enjoys today. The incident may even prompt military action by China against Russian forces out of fear of further nuclear escalation or adventurism. In the end, such a weapon is a strategic deterrent more than a weapon, a reason to deter an opponent from attacking you due to the incredible cost of doing so. Now go check out Russia's nuke targets, or click this other video instead.